Welcome to your Rooted Rest Ritual. Tonight we gather the complete chronicle of Elder Julian, the Mason of the Mountain Bone. This is the full cycle of the stone, from the heavy foundations of the library terrace to the dark mineral silence of the cloister well. We will restore the ancient heart of the refectory fire and climb into the high, echoing vaults of the chapter house, where gravity is the only master. But what does it mean to build for the centuries? How does the rhythmic and silver melody of the hammer against the granite guide a heavy spirit into the deep sleep it deserves? Tonight, we find the answers in the stone. Before we begin this long-form journey, please subscribe and like this video if you find peace in these rituals. It helps our mountain grow. Now, just settle into your surroundings. Feel the weight of the blankets and let your mind drift as we explore the complete history of the Mason of the Abbey. If you are ready, let's begin.
The air at the western slope of the Abbey was a living thing. It was not merely a void through which the monks moved, but a thick and cooling presence that carried the scent of wet lichen and the sharp metallic tang of impending rain. In this early hour, before the first bell of the morning had even thought to ring, the world was painted in varying shades of slate and charcoal. The mist clung to the jagged edges of the mountain like a soft and tattered shroud, refusing to let go of the peaks even as the sun began its slow and invisible ascent behind the heavy clouds. Elder Julian stood at the edge of the terrace where the earth gave way to a steep and rocky incline. His boots were heavy and thick with the red clay of the lower paths, but he did not seem to mind the weight. He was a man who understood weight. He understood the way it pulled at the shoulders and the way it grounded the soul to the physical world. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, watching the way the mist swirled around the base of a massive pile of fieldstones that had been gathered there over the preceding weeks. These were the bones of the mountain. They were rough and unrefined and covered in the dust of centuries of stillness. He reached out a hand and let his fingers trail over the surface of the nearest stone. It was cold enough to bite at the skin, but he did not pull away. He welcomed the sting. His palms were broad and mapped with the fine lines of a lifetime of labor. The skin was the color of rich and deep earth, polished by the constant friction of granite and flint. There was a stillness in his touch that seemed to communicate directly with the mineral heart of the rock. He was not looking for a stone that was beautiful or one that was perfectly square. He was looking for the stone that was ready to serve as the anchor. The project for the season was the restoration of the foundation wall. This was the structure that held the weight of the library above it, and for generations it had stood firm against the shifting of the tectonic plates and the relentless erosion of the seasonal storms. But the earth is always moving. It breathes in a way that humans often forget, and over the last decade a slight lean had developed in the masonry. It was Julian's task to dismantle the outer skin of the wall and rebuild it using the ancient methods of dry stone work. No mortar would be used to glue the pieces together. Instead, they would rely on the honesty of gravity and the perfect marriage of shape and friction. He knelt down on the damp ground, feeling the moisture seep through the heavy fabric of his robes. He did not rush the movement. Every bend of his knees was a deliberate act of reverence for the work ahead. He began to clear the area at the base of the wall, using a small wooden trowel to scrape away the accumulation of dead leaves and moss. The soil beneath was dark and fragrant. It smelled of ancient things, of minerals and decayed roots, and the secret history of the mountain. As he worked, his breath came in steady and rhythmic pulses, a soft sound that harmonized with the distant call of a mountain bird. When the bare earth was finally revealed, he spent a long time simply looking at it. He was reading the slope of the land and calculating where the most pressure would fall once the wall was complete. He used his hands to pat the ground, feeling for soft spots or hidden pockets of air. A wall is only as strong as the silence it sits upon. If the foundation is restless, the entire structure will eventually find its way back to the earth in a heap of rubble. He took a heavy iron bar from his tool rack and began to pack the soil down. He used the weight of his own body to drive the tool home, feeling the vibrations travel up through his arms and settle in his chest. After an hour of this preparation, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the mist into a glowing and ethereal gold. The world was beginning to wake up, but here on the western slope there was only the work. Julian turned his attention back to the pile of stones. He began the process of the sorting. This was the most meditative part of the masonry. He picked up a medium-sized stone, feeling its balance in his grip. He turned it over and over, looking at every face and every angle. He was looking for the heart of the stone, the point where its weight was most concentrated. He set that stone to his left. It was a binder. It would reach deep into the wall to tie the two faces together. He picked up another that was flat and thin like a piece of frozen water. This was a shim. It would be used to fill the tiny gaps and provide the stability that keeps a massive boulder from wobbling. One by one he moved the stones, creating a map of the wall before a single piece was even laid. His movements were slow and fluid, like a dance performed in slow motion. There was no wasted energy. There was no frustration when a stone proved to be more difficult than it first appeared. He simply listened to what the stone told him and placed it where it belonged. The largest of the stones sat at the very center of the pile. It was a massive slab of gray granite that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. This was the cornerstone. It had been pulled from the quarry months ago and had been resting here waiting for this specific day. Julian approached it with a quiet focus. He did not try to lift it immediately. Instead, he stood over it and placed both hands on its flat top. He closed his eyes and felt the immense coldness radiating from the mineral depths. He felt the age of the stone. He felt the way it had been formed under the pressure of miles of earth long before the Abbey had ever been dreamed of. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp and invigorating mountain air. He braced his legs and reached down, gripping the underside of the granite slab. With a slow and steady pull, he began to move the stone. There was a low and heavy sound as the granite ground against the earth, a sound of immense friction and weight. It was not a sharp noise, but a deep and resonant vibration that felt as though it were coming from the mountain itself. He moved the stone inch by inch, guided by the map he had drawn in his mind. When the cornerstone finally reached its destination at the base of the wall, Julian guided it into place with a series of small and precise adjustments. He used a wooden lever to tilt the stone just enough to slide a flat piece of slate beneath its rear edge. He watched as the stone settled. He watched as the weight of the granite compressed the soil beneath it, creating a bond that would last for centuries. He stepped back and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. The sun was now fully visible through the thinning clouds, casting long and dramatic shadows across the terrace. The first stage of the ritual was complete. The anchor was set. The world around him was beginning to stir with the sounds of the other monks going about their morning duties, but Elder Julian remained in his circle of silence. He sat down on a smaller rock and rested his hands on his knees. He looked at the single stone he had placed, and then he looked at the hundreds of stones that still waited in the pile. He felt no urgency. He felt no desire to finish the work quickly. He only felt the peace of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. He listened to the way the wind moved through the pine trees above him, a soft and rushing sound that mimicked the flow of a distant river. He felt the solidness of the earth beneath him and the unyielding strength of the granite at his feet. In this moment there was no past and no future. There was only the weight of the stone and the steady rhythm of his own heart. He sat in the growing light and allowed the stillness to wrap around him like a familiar garment. He remained there for a long time, watching the way the shadows moved across the ground. He watched a small beetle climb over the edge of the cornerstone, its tiny legs finding purchase in the rough surface of the granite. He watched the way the dew evaporated from the grass, leaving behind a fresh and clean scent. He was not waiting for anything. He was simply being. The work would continue when it was time. The stones would find their places and the wall would rise again. But for now the air was quiet and the mountain was at peace. Elder Julian let out a long and slow breath, feeling the tension drain from his muscles. He adjusted his position, slightly leaning back against the cool surface of the rock behind him. He let his gaze drift across the valley where the mist was finally beginning to lift, revealing the deep green of the forests below. He felt a profound sense of connection to everything around him. He was a part of the foundation. He was a part of the earth. And as the morning settled into the steady pulse of the day, he found himself resting in the center of the quietude. The sun had now crested the jagged teeth of the eastern ridge, casting long, amber fingers across the terrace. The light did not just illuminate the stone pile, it seemed to wake it. Under the direct glow, the dull grays and charcoals of the field stones transformed. Flecks of mica began to glint like trapped stars, and the deep, rusted oranges of iron deposits bled through the weathered surfaces. Elder Julian did not rise from his seat immediately. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, letting the shifting light reveal the textures that the dawn mist had hidden. This was the most vital hour. To the untrained eye, a pile of rocks was simply a chaotic tumble of debris. To Julian, it was a library of stories, each one waiting for its proper place in the narrative of the wall. He stood slowly, his joints making a soft, dry sound that mirrored the scraping of grit under his boots. He approached the pile and began the process of the reading. This was not a task of the eyes alone. It was a task of the fingertips and the palms. He reached for a stone the size of a loaf of bread, its surface pockmarked by centuries of wind and ice. He did not simply pick it up. He cupped it in both hands, feeling the temperature of the mineral. A stone that held its cold deep within its core was dense, likely a piece of basalt or heavy granite, perfect for the lower courses where the weight of the world would press down the hardest. A stone that warmed quickly under his touch was often porous, perhaps a tired piece of sandstone that would be better suited for the hardy, the internal fill of the wall where it would be protected from the lashing rain. He turned the basalt stone over, tracing a long, jagged vein of quartz that ran through its center like a frozen lightning bolt. He was looking for the bed, the natural plane on which the stone had originally formed in the earth. To place a stone against its bed was to invite a crack. To place it with the bed was to ensure it would stand for 1,000 years. He felt the subtle shift in the stone's center of gravity as he rotated it. It had a slight belly, a rounded protrusion on one side that would make it sit unevenly if placed carelessly. He noted this in his mind, cataloging the shape. This stone would need a seat carved into the earth, or a very specific partner to rest against. He moved to the next, a flat, slab-like piece of limestone that felt surprisingly light. He ran his thumb along the edge. It was sharp, almost like a blade. This was a cope, stone, or perhaps a vertical. Its flat surface was a gift. He set it aside in a specific area he had cleared for the finishers. These were the stones that would sit at the very top of the wall, their weight acting as a cap to lock everything beneath them into a single, unyielding unit. As he worked, his breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. The rhythm of the abbey, the distant chanting of the monks in the chapel, the clatter of the kitchen preparing the morning meal, faded into a dull hum. There was only the weight, the texture, and the silent language of the mountain. He found a stone that was particularly troublesome. It was awkward, shaped like a distorted triangle with no clear, flat faces. Most masons would have tossed it back into the ravine as waste, but Julian held it longer than the others. He felt the strange angles and the way it seemed to resist his grip. He closed his eyes, his hands moving over the surface with the familiarity of a sculptor. He wasn't looking for what the stone was. He was looking for what it needed. It was a hard stone. Its odd angles were perfect for wedging between two larger boulders, filling a void that no square stone could ever reach. It was a bridge. He placed it gently in the center of his sorting area, his movements reflecting a deep-seated respect for the rejected and the unusual. The dust from the rocks began to coat his hands, a fine, gray powder that settled into the deep creases of his skin. It turned his palms into a map of the work itself, the grit acting as a physical bond between the man and the material. He didn't wipe it away. The dust was part of the process, a reminder that he was not just building a wall. He was participating in the slow, grinding transformation of the landscape. He picked up a small, round pebble, no larger than a plum. It was smooth, polished by some ancient stream that had long since dried up. This was a pinning stone. It was humble, almost invisible, but in the world of dry masonry, It was the most important. It would be driven into the tiny gaps to stop a massive boulder from shifting. It was the silence between the words that gave the sentence its meaning. By the time the pile had been halved, the sun was high enough to start drawing the moisture out of the ground. A soft haze began to rise from the damp earth, smelling of minerals and old wood. Julian's robes were heavy with the weight of the day, but his spirit felt increasingly light. The reading was almost complete. He had identified the face stones, those with one flat side that would look out toward the valley. He had found the throughs, the long, heavy anchors that would span the entire width of the wall to hold the two sides together. And he had found the spalls, the small chips and fragments that would fill the internal cavities. He stood back, surveying the sorted groups. The chaos of the morning had been replaced by a deliberate order. It was a map of potential. The wall did not exist yet, but in Julian's mind, every stone was already vibrating with its future position. He looked down at his hands, seeing the way the dark earth-toned skin was now veiled in the pale dust of the mountain. There was a profound beauty in the contrast, the living hand and the ancient stone, both shaped by time, both destined to return to the same soil. He took a moment to simply stand in the center of his work. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant, cooling spray of a waterfall. He felt the foundation of the Abbey beneath his feet, the immense weight of the library, the chapel, and the cells all pressing down into the rock. He was the one who ensured that weight didn't become a burden. He was the one who turned the pressure of the earth into the stability of the home. He reached for his water skin, taking a slow, measured swallow. The water was cold and tasted of the mountain. He let it sit in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, feeling the refreshment travel down his throat. The reading was done. The stones were ready. Now, the true labor of the bedding would begin the slow, rhythmic process of placing the first course of the foundation, where the stones would meet the dirt for the first time in 1,000 years. The trench was a dark and narrow ribbon of history waiting to be rewritten. Elder Julian knelt beside it once more, his movements as steady as the mountain itself. The air had begun to lose the sharp bite of the morning, but it remained cool and heavy with the scent of damp moss and the mineral smell of the disturbed earth. This was the moment of the first marriage, the point where the ancient stones would meet the ancient soil. If this connection was not perfect, the entire wall would be a lie. A wall without a true foundation is a structure waiting for its own end, and Julian was a man who built for the centuries. He reached for the first of the massive face stones he had sorted. It was a block of gray limestone nearly the size of a small trunk. Its surface was rough and weathered, marked by the slow passage of time and the weight of the layers above it. He did not rush the lift. He centered his weight and breathed deep into his belly, feeling the strength flow from his legs through his core and into his arms. He lifted the stone and felt the massive resistance of the mineral world. It was a weight that demanded respect. It was a weight that forced a man to be present in every fiber of his being. He lowered the stone into the trench. There was a soft and heavy sound as the limestone met the packed earth, the sound of two ancient things finding one another again. Julian did not let go. He kept his hands on the sides of the stone, feeling the way it sat in the dirt. He felt a slight wobble, a minute instability that most would have ignored. But Julian knew that a wobble in the foundation becomes a lean in the wall, and a lean becomes a collapse. He lifted the front edge of the stone just a fraction and reached into his pouch for a shim. The shim was a thin wedge of slate, as flat as a coin and just as hard. He slid it beneath the limestone with the precision that came from decades of listening to the earth. He let the stone settle again. This time it was silent. It was still. It was as if the limestone had grown out of the trench itself. He spent a long time simply looking at it, ensuring that the flat face of the rock was perfectly aligned with the string line he had stretched across the terrace. The line was a guide, but his heart was the judge. Next came the hearting. This was the ritual of the interior. While the face stones provided the beauty and the visible strength, the hearting provided the soul. Julian took a handful of the smaller jagged rocks he had gathered, the broken pieces, the fragments, the stones that had no face to show the world. He began to drop them into the space behind the limestone block. Each small stone found a home in the gaps between the larger ones. It was a puzzle of infinite complexity, He used a heavy wooden mallet to pack the hearting down, making sure there were no hollow spaces where water could collect or where the frost could take hold in the winter. The repetition of the work began to create a rhythm. Lift the face stone, assess the bed, settle the weight, fill the heart. It was a cadence that transcended the passage of time. The sun moved across the sky in a slow and golden arc, but for Julian there was only the next stone. His robes were now dusted with the pale white of the limestone and the deep red of the clay. His hands were dark and powerful, the skin stretched tight over the muscles of his palms. He looked at the way the dust settled in the fine lines of his knuckles, a temporary map of the mountain's geography. He moved to the next face stone. This one was different, a piece of dark basalt that was heavier than it looked. It had a rounded back that made it difficult to see. Julian did not fight the stone. He did not try to force it to be something it was not. Instead, he took his trowel and carved a small hollow into the earth of the trench. He shaped the world to fit the stone. When he lowered the basalt into the hollow, it fit with a finality that felt like a closing door. It was a perfect union. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction deep in his chest, but he did not let it break his focus. As the first course of the wall began to take shape, the scale of the task became clear. This was not a wall that would be finished in a day or even a week. It was a work of patience. It was a work of stillness. Julian thought about the library that sat above him. He thought about the thousands of scrolls and books, the history of the Abbey, and the wisdom of the elders. All of it was supported by the work he was doing here in the dirt. Every word ever written in the library rested on the stones he was placing with such care. It was a heavy responsibility, but he did not find it burdensome. He found it grounding. He stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from his eyes. The wind had shifted, coming now from the north, and carrying the smell of the high pines and the distant snow. He looked at the line of stones he had laid. They were raw and unrefined, but they were honest. They did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. They were the foundation. They were the beginning. He reached for another handful of pinning stones, small slivers of rock that he would use to lock the larger blocks together. He knelt in the dirt and began to drive the pins into the gaps. He did not use a hammer for this. He used the weight of a larger stone to tap them home. He felt the vibration travel through his arm, a steady and resonant pulse. Each pin made the structure stronger. Each pin turned a collection of individual rocks into a single living thing. He worked with a meticulousness that bordered on the sacred. To Julian, there was no difference between a prayer in the chapel and the placing of a stone in the wall. Both were acts of creation. Both were ways of connecting to the source of all things. The shadows were lengthening again, stretching across the trench like long and dark fingers. The first course was nearly complete. A solid and unyielding base that stretched across the terrace, waiting for the layers that would follow. Julian sat back on his heels and looked at his work. The wall was low, only a few inches above the ground, but it felt immense. It felt permanent. He could see the way the different colors of the stones, the grays, the blacks, the oranges, blended together into a single tapestry of the earth. He stood up and stretched his back, feeling the muscles pull and release. He was tired, but it was a good tiredness. It was the fatigue of a man who has done exactly what he was meant to do. He looked out over the valley where the first lights of the evening were beginning to flicker in the distance. The world was preparing for the night, but the wall was just beginning its long watch. He took a heavy canvas cloth and covered the sorted stones, protecting them from the evening dew. He gathered his tools, cleaning each one with a dry rag before placing it back in his raft. He handled the iron bar and the wooden mallet with the same reverence he showed the stones. They were his partners in the work. He looked at the foundation one last time, ensuring that everything was as it should be. The line was straight. The stones were still. The heart was full. He felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a quietude that was as solid as the limestone. The sky had begun to deepen into a shade of violet that felt heavy and cool against the back of Julian's neck. The first course of the foundation was now a solid and silent presence in the trench, a line of dark limestone and gray granite that looked as though it had been there since the beginning of the world. But a single layer of stone is not a wall. It is only a promise. To fulfill that promise, Julian had to begin the second course. This was the stage of the work known as the bond. It was the moment where the individual stones ceased to be separate entities and became a singular and unbreakable whole. The secret to a dry stone wall lies in the overlap. One stone must always sit across the joint where two stones meet below it. This creates a bridge of weight that locks everything into place. If the joints are allowed to stack one on top of the other, the wall will eventually split like a piece of dry wood. Julian stood over the sorted pile of rocks and let his gaze drift across the shapes. He was looking for the stones that would serve as the binders. These were the long and heavy pieces that would reach across the width of the wall to tie the inner and outer faces together. He reached down and gripped a slab of dark basalt that was as long as his forearm. It was dense and cold. The surface was covered in tiny pits and ridges that would provide the friction necessary to hold its neighbors in a firm embrace. He lifted it with a slow and deliberate exhale, feeling the tension in his lower back and the familiar pull in his biceps. He did not rush the walk to the trench. Every step was a calculation of balance. He lowered the basalt slab onto the first course. He positioned it carefully so that it rested directly over the seam where a piece of granite met a piece of limestone. He felt the stones settle. He felt the way the weight was distributed across the two stones below. There was a faint and gritty sound as the minerals ground against one another, a sound of immense pressure and ancient stability. Julian kept his hands on the rock for a long moment, feeling for any sign of movement. The stone was still. It was a perfect bridge. He reached for a handful of small slate chips and began to shim the edges. He pushed the thin slivers of rock into the tiny gaps with his thumb, feeling the grit beneath his nail and the rough texture of the stone against his skin. The process of building the second course was slower than the first. It required a higher level of awareness. He had to consider not just the stone he was holding, but also the stones that would eventually sit on top of it. He was thinking 3 moves ahead, like a player in a game of strategy. He picked up a piece of sandstone that had a warm and reddish hue. It was softer than the basalt, but it was flat and reliable. He placed it next to the binder, ensuring that it also overlapped a joint. The wall was beginning to rise out of the earth now. It was no longer just a line in the dirt. It was becoming a physical barrier, a structure that defined the space between the mountain and the Abbey. Julian worked with a quiet and focused intensity. The dust from the stones had turned his hands a pale and ghostly gray, a stark contrast to the deep and rich tone of his skin. He watched the way the sunlight caught the fine powder in the air, creating a hazy and ethereal glow around his workspace. The world outside the terrace was starting to fade as the shadows of the pine trees grew long and thin. He could hear the distant tolling of the evening bell calling the monks to their prayers, but he did not move to join them. His prayer was here in the weight of the basalt and the steady rhythm of the masonry. He believed that the Creator was present in the grain of the rock as much as in the words of the Scripture. He reached for a particularly large stone that he had been saving for this specific corner. It was a massive piece of quartz speckled granite that looked like a frozen piece of the night sky. It was heavy enough that he had to use his entire body to move it. He braced his feet against the edge of the trench and pulled the stone toward him inch by inch. The friction was immense. He could feel the heat generated by the movement. When the granite was finally in position, he guided it down with a series of small and precise shoves. It landed with a deep and resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his boots. He stepped back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. His breath was steady, and his heart was calm. The second course was now halfway complete. The intersection of the different stone types created a beautiful and complex pattern. The dark basalt contrasted with the pale limestone and the reddish sandstone, while the granite provided a spark of light in the deepening shadows. It was a tapestry of the earth. Julian took a small wooden tool and began to pack the internal hearting into the center of the wall. He used the broken fragments and the small pebbles to fill every void. He was creating a solid core that would act as a shock absorber against the shifting of the mountain. He worked with a meticulousness that left no room for error. A single hollow space could allow water to enter and freeze, causing the wall to heave and buckle in the winter. He felt a deep sense of connection to the men who had built the Abbey centuries ago. They had stood on the same slope and handled these same types of stones. They had felt the same weight in their shoulders and the same grit on their palms. He was part of a long and unbroken line of builders who understood that the only way to create something lasting was to move slowly. To be fast was to be careless. To be slow was to be eternal. He picked up a small and rounded stone that looked like a river pebble and tucked it into a gap near the corner. It was a small act, but it was vital. The wind had died down, leaving the air perfectly still. The only sound was the occasional scrape of Julian's trowel and the soft rustle of his robes as he moved. He was completely alone in the growing dusk, but he did not feel lonely. He felt the presence of the mountain all around him. He felt the weight of the library behind him and the depth of the forest below. He was the anchor. He was the point where the world of men and the world of the earth met and found a common language. He placed the last stone of the hour, a flat piece of slate that would serve as a level base for the third course. He stood up and looked at his hands. They were tired and the skin was raw in places, but they were satisfied hands. He looked at the wall and saw the way the second course had transformed the structure. It was now a singular unit. It was a bond that could not be easily broken. He felt the quietude of the evening settling over the terrace. The light was almost gone now, leaving the world in a state of soft and blue transition. He did not feel the need to rush back to his cell. He sat on a nearby boulder and watched as the first stars began to appear in the gaps between the clouds. The work of the day was done, but the story of the stone was just beginning. The foundation was set, and the bond was formed. As the darkness finally took hold of the western slope, Elder Julian remained in his seat. He listened to the silence of the mountain and the steady pulse of the earth. He felt the peace that comes from doing a thing well and from knowing that the work will stand long after the builder is gone. He sat in the center of the quietude and allowed the night to wrap around him. The night had now fully claimed the western slope, and the stars were thick and vibrant above the silhouette of the Abbey. The air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the faint and distant rush of the wind through the highest peaks. Elder Julian did not move from his seat for a long time. He allowed the coolness of the evening to seep into his bones and soothe the heat of the day's labor. His hands rested on his knees, and he felt the weight of the mountain pressing up through the soles of his boots. This was the time of the witnessing. It was the moment when the builder stepped away from the work to see what the earth had accepted. He rose slowly and walked back to the edge of the trench. In the dim starlight, the two courses of the wall looked like a low and heavy shadow. He did not use a lantern. He did not need to see the stones with his eyes to know if they were right. He knelt in the dirt and reached out with his right hand. He ran his fingers along the face of the second course, feeling the way the basalt and the limestone sat together. He felt the seams where the stones overlapped, and the way the shims held the weight in perfect balance. He moved his hand slowly across the entire length of the foundation, feeling for any hint of a vibration or a shift. The stones were silent. They were rooted. They had become part of the mountain. Satisfied, he returned to his workspace and gathered his tools. This was the final ritual of the day, the cleansing of the companions. He took a heavy roll of canvas and spread it out on a flat rock. One by one he laid out his tools: the iron bar, the heavy wooden mallet, the collection of chisels. Each one was coated in the fine and abrasive dust of the masonry. Julian took a small jar of linseed oil and a thick rag made of coarse wool. He began to wipe away the grit. He started with the mallet. He worked the oil into the wood, feeling the grains soak up the moisture. He polished the handle until it was smooth and dark in the starlight. He did this not just to preserve the tool, but to honor the work it had done. He moved on to the chisels. He wiped the steel until it gleamed with a dull and honest light. He checked the edges for any chips or dullness, and he felt the weight of the metal in his palm. These were the instruments of transformation. They were the bridge between his will and the unyielding nature of the rock. As he cleaned each tool, he thought about the specific stones they had shaped that day. He remembered the strike that had settled the granite and the nudge that had aligned the basalt. The tools were an extension of his own body, and he treated them with the same care he gave his own limbs. Once the tools were clean and oiled, he wrapped them tightly in the canvas roll. He tied the bundle with a leather cord and tucked it into a protected hollow in the rock. Now it was time to cleanse the builder. He walked to a small stone basin that sat near the terrace. It was filled with rainwater that had been collected during the previous night. The water was cold enough to make his skin tingle, but he welcomed the shock. He dipped his hands into the basin and began to wash away the dust of the mountain. He watched the way the gray and red silt clouded the water, and he felt the weight of the day lifting from his skin. He washed his arms up to the elbows and then splashed the cool water over his face and neck. The scent of the rain was fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the heavy and mineral smell of the trench. He dried himself with a simple linen cloth and stood for a moment looking out over the valley. The lights of the world below were far away and insignificant compared to the vastness of the night sky. He felt small, but he did not feel unimportant. He was the keeper of the foundation. He was the one who made the silence solid. He felt a deep and profound sense of peace settle over his heart. The work was not finished, but it was complete for this cycle. The stones were in their places and the earth was at rest. Julian walked slowly back toward the abbey, his footsteps making no sound on the soft grass. He reached the small stone cell that served as his quarters. It was a simple room with a straw pallet and a single wooden stool. The walls were made of the same stone he had been working with all day, and he felt a sense of comfort in their presence. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his heavy boots. He felt the air move over his tired feet, and he let out a long and slow breath. His muscles were heavy and his mind was quiet. There was no more need for thought or for action. He lay back on the pallet and pulled a heavy wool blanket up to his chin. The smell of the wool and the cool air of the room wrapped around him like a familiar garment. He looked up at the ceiling where the shadows danced in the faint light coming from the window. He felt the pulse of the mountain beneath his bed and the steady rhythm of his own heart. The fatigue was a warm and heavy blanket of its own, pressing him down into the stillness of the room. He closed his eyes and let the world fade away. There was only the weight of the stone and the depth of the night. In the center of the terrace, the wall stood watch in the darkness, and here in the cell the builder finally let go of the day. And in that deep and heavy quietude he rested. The morning arrived with a clarity that the previous day had lacked. The heavy mist that had clung to the western slope had been chased away by a brisk northern wind, leaving the air sharp and clean. Elder Julian stood at the edge of his work site, watching the first true rays of the sun strike the two courses he had laid the day before. The stone looked different in this light. The gray granite seemed deeper, and the dark basalt appeared almost blue. The foundation was settled and firm. It had survived its first night in the open air, and now it was ready to grow. Julian reached into his tool rack and pulled out the heavy steel hammer and the broad-faced chisel. These were the instruments of the third course. While the first two layers were about the marriage of stone and earth, the third course was about the marriage of stone and spirit. This was the layer where the wall would begin to show its face to the world. It required a level of precision that went beyond mere placement. The stones had to be dressed. Their wild and jagged edges had to be tamed so that the outer surface of the wall would be a smooth and continuous plane of strength. He selected a large block of limestone from the remaining pile. It was a sturdy piece, but it had a stubborn protrusion on its front face that would prevent it from sitting flush with the stones below. Julian knelt on the cold ground and placed the limestone on a bed of soft sand to steady it. He ran his hand over the rough surface, feeling the grain and the hidden fractures. He was looking for the point of least resistance. He placed the edge of the chisel against the offending bump of rock and adjusted the angle of the steel. He did not strike immediately. He waited until he felt the connection between the tool and the heart of the stone. When he finally brought the hammer down, the sound was a short and heavy report that echoed off the library walls above. There was no ringing note, only a dull and final vibration that traveled up through his arm and settled in his shoulder. A small flake of limestone sheared away and tumbled into the dust. Julian did not pause. He adjusted the chisel a fraction of an inch and struck again. He worked with a deliberate and rhythmic pace. Each blow was calculated to remove just enough material to reveal the flat face hidden within the raw rock. The dust began to rise in small and pale clouds, coating his dark forearms and settling in the fine hair of his wrists. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the dust was a sign of progress. It was the physical evidence of the stone's transformation. He moved his hand over the newly revealed surface and felt the cool and slightly chalky texture. It was becoming smooth. It was becoming a part of the Abbey. He turned the stone over and began to work on the base, ensuring it was perfectly flat so it would not rock once placed on the bond below. The sun climbed higher, turning the sweat on Julian's brow into a salt-streaked map of his labor. He moved from stone to stone, treating each one with the same meticulous care. Some required only a single strike to find their true shape, while others were stubborn and required an hour of patient carving. He never lost his temper with the material. He knew that the stone had been formed over millions of years, and it would not be hurried by a man who had only a few decades of breath in him. He respected the time the mineral had taken to become itself, and in return the stone allowed him to guide its future. As he finished dressing each piece, he carried it to the wall. The weight was familiar and grounding. He lowered the third course into place, feeling the way the newly carved faces aligned with the string line. The wall was rising. It was no longer just a foundation hidden in a trench. It was a presence. It stood nearly a foot high now, and the pattern of the different stones began to create a visual harmony. The dark basalt binders spanned the width of the structure, holding the inner and outer faces in a permanent embrace. Julian reached for his bag of shims and began the delicate process of leveling the course. He used tiny slivers of slate to compensate for the natural variations in the stone. He pushed them deep into the gaps with a small wooden probe, ensuring that every point of contact was solid. He was building for the wind and the rain and the slow movement of the mountain. He was building for the silence. He stopped for a moment to look down the length of the wall. The face was flush and true. It looked like a single living entity rather than a collection of separate rocks. He felt a deep sense of connection to the structure. He was pouring his own strength into the minerals, and in return the minerals were giving him a sense of permanence. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of the kitchens and the distant sound of the brothers in the garden. Julian remained in his circle of focus. He picked up his hammer once more and reached for the next stone. The rhythm of the work was a meditation, a long and slow conversation between the man and the mountain. He did not think about the end of the wall or the years it would take to finish the restoration. He only thought about the next strike of the chisel and the next grain of the stone. The sun had reached a point in the sky where the shadows of the pine trees began to shrink toward their trunks. The western slope was bathed in a clear and unforgiving light that revealed every imperfection in the stone. Elder Julian stood before a specific boulder that had remained at the bottom of the pile since the beginning of the week. It was a massive erratic, a piece of ancient volcanic rock that had been carried here by a glacier long before the first monks had ever set foot on this mountain. It was dark and dense, with a surface that looked like cooling lava frozen in time. Unlike the limestone or the granite, this stone did not have a clear grain. It was a singular and stubborn mass of mineral history, and it was too large to be moved into the wall as it was. Julian knelt in the dust and placed his hands on the rough surface. The stone was cold despite the midday sun. It seemed to pull the warmth directly from his palms, as if it were hungry for the heat of the living. He did not move for several minutes. He was searching for the hidden heart of the boulder. He ran his fingers over the various ridges and pits, looking for a line of weakness that only a mason could see. He found a faint discoloration, a slight streak of quartz that ran deep into the center of the mass. This was the path. This was where the stone would eventually yield, but it would not be an easy victory. He reached for his heavy iron bag and pulled out a set of feathers and wedges. These were simple tools, but they were the most powerful in his collection. He took a heavy steel drill and a short-handled hammer and began the process of the piercing. He placed the point of the drill against the quartz vein and struck the end with a deliberate and controlled force. The sound was a deep and resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire terrace. He did not swing with his whole arm. He moved from the wrist and the elbow, keeping his movements compact and efficient. After 20 strikes, he had created a small and perfect hole in the heart of the volcanic rock. He moved 6 inches down the line and began again. The repetition was a form of prayer. His breath became synchronized with the movement of the hammer. Strike and breathe. Strike and breathe. The dust from the drill was a fine and dark powder that coated his fingers and turned the skin of his forearms a deep shade of charcoal. He did not wipe it away. He allowed the grit to become a part of his grip. By the time he had drilled 5 holes across the face of the boulder, the sweat was carving channels through the dust on his forehead. He stopped to take a slow and measured drink of water from his skin. He did not rush. The stone had been here for millions of years, and a few more minutes of patience would not change the outcome. He took the steel feathers, which were too thin, and curved pieces of metal and placed them into the first hole. Then he inserted the wedge between them. He repeated this for all 5 holes until the boulder looked as if it were wearing a crown of iron. Now came the moment of the gathering. Julian did not strike the wedges with his full strength. That would only bounce the steel or break the tool. Instead, he began to tap the top of each wedge in a steady and rhythmic sequence. He moved from left to right, and then back again. The sound was different now. It was higher and sharper, a metallic song that rang out across the valley. With each pass, the tension within the stone increased. He could feel it through the soles of his boots. The boulder was resisting. It was holding on to its unity with everything it had. Julian increased the weight of his strikes just a fraction. He was listening for a specific sound, a change in the pitch of the metal that would signal the beginning of the end. He was in no hurry. He watched a hawk circling high above in the blue void, and he felt the immense stillness of the mountain pressing in on him. He was a part of that stillness. He was the focus point of the pressure. On the 10th pass, the sound changed. It was no longer a ring, but a dull and heavy groan that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Julian stopped. He laid his hammer down and stood perfectly still. He did not need to strike again. He watched as a hairline fracture appeared at the first hole. It was thinner than a strand of hair, but it was moving. The crack traveled slowly along the quartz vein, jumping from hole to hole with a sound like a distant piece of ice breaking on a lake. The internal pressure of the volcanic rock was finally turning against itself. With a final and muffled sound, the boulder split in two. The two halves fell away from each other, revealing a center that had not seen the light of the sun for an eternity. The interior of the stone was a beautiful and iridescent black, like the surface of a deep pond at midnight. It was smooth and glassed, like a sharp contrast to the weathered and rough exterior. A faint and metallic smell rose from the newly exposed faces, a scent of ancient fires and the deep crust of the world. Julian reached out and touched the heart of the stone. It was surprisingly warm. The energy of the break had left a lingering heat in the mineral. He spent the next hour shaping the two halves into usable blocks. He used his smaller chisel to dress the edges and remove the jagged bits left by the split. He worked with a quiet and intense focus, his movements fluid and practiced. The volcanic stone was difficult to carve, but it was rewarding. Every piece that he removed was a victory of patience over resistance. By the time the sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, he had 2 perfect binders for the 4th course. These stones would be the anchors of the next layer, their density and weight providing the necessary stability for the library wall above. He carried the first of the new blocks to the wall. It was heavy enough that he felt the strain in his legs and the pull in his shoulders, but it was a good weight. He lowered the volcanic stone onto the bond of the 3rd course. It fit with a finality that made the air around it seem still. He reached for his shims and began the leveling process, once more his hands moving with a grace that masked the immense labor involved. The wall was now rising toward his waist. It was a physical manifestation of his days of effort, a structure of earth and stone and silent intention. Julian looked at his hands and saw the map of the work written in the dust and the fine lines of his palms. He felt the fatigue in his joints, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He looked at the split boulder, and then at the rising wall, and he felt the connection between the two. The mountain was being reshaped one stone at a time, and he was the one chosen to guide the change. He sat down on a nearby rock and watched the shadows begin to stretch across the terrace. The world was preparing for the evening, but the wall was standing firm, a new foundation for the ancient Abbey. The sun moved across the vast and open sky with a slow and golden weight, and the heat began to draw the moisture from the very core of the stones. Elder Julian stood before the 4th course of the wall, and he felt the shift in the work. The foundation was buried and the base was solid, and now the wall was truly rising into the world of the air and the light. This was the stage where the internal structure became just as important as the external face. Julian turned away from the outer pile of boulders and looked at the smaller mounds of debris he had gathered over the weeks. This was the material for the hearting. He knelt in the grit and began to gather the small and jagged fragments of rock that most would have called waste. These were the broken bits of flint, and the shards of granite, and the smooth river pebbles that had no place on the visible surface of the wall. To a master mason, these were the secret strength of the structure. Julian took a handful of the sharp stones and began to drop them into the hollow center between the two outer faces of the wall. The sound was a bright and crystalline rattle, a chorus of mineral voices finding their places in the dark gaps. He did not simply toss them in. He placed them with the same care he had used for the massive binders of the previous courses. He used a heavy wooden rammer to pack the hearting down, and he felt the vibration of the impact travel through the handle and into the marrow of his bones. Every strike was a conversation with the gravity of the mountain. He was ensuring that there were no air pockets and no hidden voids where the frost could take root in the coming winter. The hearting had to be a single and unyielding mass that would press outward against the face stones and lock them into a permanent embrace. Julian worked in a steady and rhythmic circle, and his breath was a low and constant sound that matched the thud of the rammer. As he worked, he noticed a slight shift in the alignment of the limestone block on the northern corner. It was a minute movement, and a change of only a fraction of an inch, but to Julian it was as loud as a shout. He laid down the rammer and reached for his plumb line. This was a simple tool made of a heavy lead weight and a length of rough hemp cord. He held the end of the cord against the top edge of the wall and allowed the lead to dangle toward the earth. He was measuring the battle. A dry stone wall cannot be perfectly vertical, or it will eventually topple under its own weight. It must lean inward with a subtle and graceful slope so that every stone is constantly pressing toward the center. Julian watched the lead weight as it settled in the still air. He saw the way the cord bisected the shadow of the wall, and he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The lean was true. The batter was following the ancient proportions that had been handed down through generations of builders at the Abbey. He reached for a small pinning stone and tapped it into a gap near the base of the limestone block. He watched as the stone adjusted itself, and the gap disappeared into the solid mass of the structure. The wall was not a static thing. It was alive and moving and constantly finding its own balance. The dust from the hearting was different from the dust of the dressing. It was darker and more fragrant, smelling of the deep earth and the ancient minerals of the trench. It settled into the fine lines of Julian's palms, and it turned his knuckles into a landscape of gray and charcoal. He looked at his hands, and he saw the history of the work written in the skin. He saw the small scars from the flint and the calluses from the granite, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was not just building a wall. He was building a testament to the patience of the man and the permanence of the mountain. He moved to the center of the terrace and selected a through stone. This was a massive and long piece of gray slate that was intended to span the entire width of the wall from the outer face to the inner core. It was the bridge that would hold the two sides together. Julian braced his legs and lifted the slate, and he felt the immense strain in his thighs and his lower back. The weight was a physical presence that demanded everything he had to give. He walked slowly to the wall, and he guided the slate into position. It landed with a heavy and final sound that seemed to anchor the entire fourth course to the earth. He stood back and wiped the sweat from his neck with a damp cloth. The sun was now beginning its long descent, and the shadows of the library were stretching across the terrace like dark and protective wings. Julian looked at the progress of the day, and he saw the way the different stones were beginning to blend into a single and harmonious whole. The dark basalt and the gray limestone and the reddish sandstone were no longer separate entities. They were the wall. They were the foundation. They were the rooted strength of the Abbey. He took a small wooden trowel and began to smooth the surface of the hearting, ensuring that it was level and ready for the fifth course. He worked with a meticulous and quiet focus, and he felt the stillness of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment. He was alone on the slope, but he did not feel the weight of the solitude. He felt the presence of the earth, and and the memory of the builders who had come before him and the promise of the stones that were yet to be laid. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the work he found his peace. The wind shifted again, coming now from the high peaks and carrying the scent of the coming rain. Julian looked up at the sky and saw the first thin clouds gathering on the horizon. He knew that the work would soon have to stop for the day, but he felt no urgency to finish. The wall would wait. The stones would remain. He reached for a final handful of small pebbles and dropped them into a gap in the center of the course. The sound was a soft and final click, and the ritual of the hearting was complete for the hour. The sun had begun to descend behind the highest peaks of the mountain, casting the western slope into a long and cooling shadow. The air was perfectly still, and the distant sounds of the Abbey had faded into a soft and rhythmic hum. Elder Julian stood before the fourth course of the wall, and he felt the transition from the physical labor of the day to the subtle art of the witnessing. This was the moment where he would check the spirit of the wall. A dry stone wall is not just a collection of rocks. It is a single and living entity that must vibrate with a unified voice. If one stone is loose or if one shim is poorly placed, the entire structure will carry a flaw that only the ears of a mason can detect. Julian reached into his tool rack and pulled out a small mallet made of aged and polished oak. It was a light and balanced tool, designed not for the heavy work of shaping but for the delicate task of listening. He knelt at the base of the northern corner, where the wall met the earth, and he placed his left hand flat against the surface of a large granite block. He felt the coldness of the mineral and the faint grit of the dust against his palm. He closed his eyes and allowed the rest of his senses to fade away until there was only the stone and the silence of the mountain. He began the ritual at the very bottom, tapping the oak mallet against the center of the first face stone. The sound was a deep and heavy thud, a resonance that felt as though it were coming from the heart of the mountain itself. It was a solid sound, a confirmation that the foundation was settled and firm. Julian moved his hand up to the second course, following the vibration through the layers of the masonry. He tapped the dark basalt binder, and the sound was higher and sharper, a crystalline ring that spoke of the density of the volcanic rock. He moved his mallet in a slow and steady rhythm, traveling the length of the wall like a musician tuning an immense and silent instrument. When he reached the center of the third course, he tapped a piece of gray limestone, and the sound changed. It was a hollow and rattling ring, a discordant note in the harmony of the structure. Julian stopped. He did not need to see the flaw to know it was there. He ran his fingers over the edges of the limestone, feeling for the tiny gap that his ears had discovered. He found a small pinning stone that had shifted during the packing of the hearting. It was a minute error, a movement of only a few millimeters, but in the world of the mason it was a breach of the silence. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a thin sliver of slate. He moved with a quiet and deliberate focus, his hands dark against the pale gray of the limestone. He slid the slate into the gap behind the pinning stone, and he used the handle of his mallet to tap it home. He felt the resistance of the wall as the shim took hold and the weight of the course was redistributed. He tapped the limestone once more. The sound was now full and firm, a deep and resonant thud that matched the stones around it. The spirit of the wall was restored. The discord had been resolved. Julian continued the ritual, moving his mallet across the fourth course and into the corners of the structure. He was listening for the bond. He wanted to hear the way the stones interacted with one another, the way the weight of the binders pressed down on the layers below. He found a section where the granite and the sandstone met, and he spent a long time tapping the joints and feeling the vibrations in his fingertips. The wall was singing a song of stability and permanence. It was a heavy and grounding music, a sound that reinforced the rooted nature of the Abbey. The dust on his hands had turned into a fine and gray paste as the moisture of the evening began to settle on the terrace. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the earth had reclaimed his skin. He was a part of the masonry. He was the bridge between the raw materials of the mountain and the finished structure of the wall. He felt a deep sense of connection to the stones, a feeling of mutual respect and understanding. He was not their master. He was their companion. He was the one who gave them a place to stand and a reason to be still. As he finished the ritual at the southern end of the terrace, the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Julian stood up and stretched his back, feeling the pull of the muscles in his shoulders and his thighs. The fatigue of the day was a warm and heavy presence, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of peace. He looked at the wall, and he saw more than just a barrier of rock. He saw a testament to the patience of the spirit. The wall was true. The spirit was solid. The foundation of the library was secure for another generation. He replaced the wooden mallet in his wrap, and he took a final look at the progress of the day. The four courses stood nearly as high as his waist, a dark and powerful ridge of earth and stone that looked as though it had always been a part of the slope. He could see the different textures of the rocks in the fading light, the rough grain of the granite, and the smooth glass of the basalt, and the chalky surface of the limestone. They were a unified whole, a single voice in the silence of the mountain. Julian sat down on his favorite observation rock, and he allowed the quietude to wrap around him. He did not think about the work of tomorrow or the weight of the stones that were yet to be moved. He only thought about the resonance of the wall and the way the earth felt beneath his feet. He was the mason of the western slope, and his heart was as steady as the granite at his back. The air was cooling rapidly, and the smell of the coming rain was growing stronger, but Julian remained in his seat. He was waiting for the final transformation of the day, the moment when the mountain would begin to breathe in the dampness of the night. The air on the western slope had changed from the dry and mineral heat of the afternoon to a heavy and electric stillness. The sky was no longer a vast and open blue, but a deep and bruised purple that seemed to press down on the peaks of the mountain. Elder Julian remained on his observation rock, his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the horizon where the clouds were gathered in thick and silent ranks. He felt the first stirrings of the wind, a cool and damp current that carried the scent of wet pine needles and distant lightning. It was the breath of the storm, a precursor to the cleansing that was about to begin. He watched the first drop of rain as it fell. It did not land on the earth or the grass, but on the dark and polished surface of the volcanic binder he had placed in the fourth course. The drop was large and heavy, and it shattered against the stone into 1,000 tiny jewels of moisture. Julian did not move. He watched as a second drop landed on the back of his hand, a cold and sudden sting against his dark skin. He felt the water as it traveled down the fine lines of his knuckles, washing away a small trail of the gray limestone dust. It was a sensory transition, a shift from the world of the dry and the solid to the world of the fluid and the cooling. Within moments, the steady patter of the rain began to fill the silence of the terrace. It was not a violent downpour, but a rhythmic and gentle baptism of the mountain. Julian stood up slowly, his joints feeling the sudden drop in temperature. He did not feel the need to seek shelter immediately. He stood in the center of the workspace and allowed the rain to wash over him. He felt the moisture soaking into the heavy fabric of his robes and the cooling sensation of the water on his scalp and his neck. He closed his eyes and turned his face toward the sky, breathing in the fresh and metallic scent of the petrichor. The rain was the final companion of the masonry, the element that would settle the dust and bind the spirit of the wall to the moisture of the earth. He turned his attention to the site, moving with a calm and deliberate pace. The rain was a gift, but it was also a force that required respect. He walked to the pile of sorted stones, and he began to cover them with a heavy canvas tarpaulin. He did not want the delicate limestone or the porous sandstone to become oversaturated before they were placed in the wall. He used several large river pebbles to weight the edges of the canvas, ensuring that the wind would not carry it away in the night. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands moving with the grace of a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. Next, he turned to his tools. He gathered the hammer and the chisels from the flat rock where they had been resting. The steel was already gleaming with a thin layer of moisture, and he knew that he would need to be thorough with the oiling later that evening. He placed the tools in their canvas wrap, and he tucked the bundle into the deepest and most protected hollow of the rock. He checked the string line one last time, ensuring that the tension was still true despite the weight of the water. The line was a thin and dark silhouette against the gray of the masonry, a steady guide in the middle of the changing weather. Julian walked to the edge of the wall, and he watched the way the rain interacted with the masonry. The water did not sit on the surface of the stones, but flowed into the gaps in the joints, disappearing into the hearting he had packed so carefully. This was the true test of the masonry. A well-built wall would allow the water to pass through without trapping it, preventing the internal pressure that could lead to a collapse. He saw the way the moisture darkened the colors of the rock, turning the gray granite into a deep charcoal and the reddish sandstone into a vibrant and earthy orange. The wall was beautiful in the rain, a living tapestry of the mountain's history. He knelt in the wet dirt, and he reached out to touch the fourth course. The stone was slick and cold, but it felt as solid as the mountain itself. He felt the weight of the rain as it pressed down on the structure, a natural force that the wall was designed to withstand. He felt a deep sense of connection to the storm. The rain was part of the cycle of the earth, the same cycle that had formed the minerals and the same cycle that would eventually return the wall to the soil. He was not a builder standing against nature. He was a builder working within it. The wind began to pick up, a low and rushing sound that moved through the pine trees like the tide of a distant ocean. The light was almost gone now, leaving the western slope in a state of soft and watery transition. Julian stood up and wiped the water from his eyes. He felt a deep and satisfied tiredness in his bones, the fatigue of a man who had met the challenges of the day and found his place in the order of the world. He was ready for the quietude of his cell and the steady pulse of the rest. He took a final look at the wall, a dark and powerful ridge in the middle of the falling rain. It was standing firm, a silent sentinel on the slope of the Abbey. He felt the peace of the mountain settling over his heart, a calm that was as deep and as unyielding as the granite at his feet. He turned away from the terrace and began the slow walk back toward the Abbey. His footsteps were silent on the wet grass, and the sound of the rain followed him like a familiar song. The day of the mason was over, and the night of the mountain had begun. The door of the cell was a heavy slab of seasoned oak that fit perfectly within the stone frame. When Elder Julian closed it, the sound of the storm was muffled and transformed into a deep and resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the very floor of the room. The interior of the cell was small and sparse, containing only a wooden stool and a straw pallet and a small shelf for a few modest belongings. The walls were made of the same gray granite he had spent the day shaping on the western slope. To any other man the room might have felt cold or confining, but to Julian it was a place of profound connection. He lived within the very material he mastered, and he felt the immense weight and stability of the Abbey pressing in on him with a protective and silent strength. He moved to the center of the room and began the slow process of removing his outer robe. The fabric was heavy and dark with the moisture of the mountain, and it clung to his shoulders with a cold and persistent weight. He pulled the garment over his head, and he felt the sudden release of the pressure and the cool movement of the air against his skin. His undershirt was also damp, but he did not rush to change it. He stood for a long moment in the center of the cell, and he allowed his body to adjust to the temperature of the stone. His skin was the color of the deep and fertile earth of the valley, and it gleamed in the dim light of the single candle that sat on the shelf. The fine lines of his muscles were etched with the fatigue of the masonry, and the grit of the limestone was still visible in the creases of his elbows and the webbing of his fingers. He took a dry linen cloth and began to wipe the moisture from his arms and his chest. The texture of the cloth was rough and invigorating, and it stimulated the circulation in his tired limbs. He worked with a quiet and rhythmic focus, following the same path he took when he was cleaning his tools. He dried his hands with a particular care, ensuring that every trace of the stone dust was removed from his palms. His hands were the primary instruments of his life, and he treated them with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. They were the bridge between the world of the spirit and the world of the rock, and they carried the history of every wall he had ever built. Once he was dry, he sat on the edge of the straw pallet, and he allowed his gaze to drift to the single window of the cell. It was a narrow opening cut deep into the granite, and it looked out toward the high peaks of the mountain. He could see the rain as it swept across the darkness in long and silver sheets, and he could hear the liquid cadence of the storm as it struck the exterior of the Abbey. The sound was a complex and beautiful tapestry of noise. There was the sharp and percussive impact of the drops against the stone walls, and the softer and more rhythmic drumming of the water on the slate roof above. There was the rushing sound of the wind as it moved through the narrow gaps and the low and constant gurgle of the overflow from the stone gutters. Julian closed his eyes and allowed the sound to wash over him. He felt the resonance of the storm within the very marrow of his bones. To his trained ears, the rain was telling him the story of the Abbey. He could hear the points where the masonry was solid and the points where the moisture was finding a way into the joints. He thought about the wall he had built that day, and he imagined the way the rain was interacting with the fourth course. He could feel the water flowing over the volcanic binders and settling into the hearting, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the integrity of the work. The wall was breathing. It was accepting the gift of the moisture, and it was holding firm against the weight of the night. The candle on the shelf flickered and cast long and dancing shadows across the granite walls. Julian watched the way the light played over the rough surface of the stone, and he saw the faces of the rocks he had laid years before. Every stone in his cell had a personality, and a history, and a specific place in the order of the building. He felt as though he were surrounded by old friends. The stones were silent, but they were not empty. They were filled with the memory of the earth, and the patience of the builders, and the steady pulse of the mountain. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had chosen. He was a man of the foundation, and he found his meaning in the slow and certain movement of the mineral world. The fatigue in his body was no longer a sharp and biting pain, but a warm and heavy blanket that seemed to pull him toward the earth. He felt the tension leading his shoulders, and the steady rhythm of his heart slowing to match the pace of the rain. He was not just listening to the storm, he was becoming a part of it. The boundary between the builder and the building was starting to dissolve. He was the stone, and he was the rain, and he was the silence of the Abbey. He reached out and touched the wall beside his bed, and he felt the immense and cooling presence of the granite. It was a solid and unyielding reality that gave him a sense of absolute security. He remained on the edge of the pallet for a long time, simply being present in the center of the quietude. He did not think about the work of the coming morning or the stones that were yet to be shaped. He only thought about the beauty of the rain and the strength of the foundation and the peace that comes from a day of honest labor. The world outside the cell was a place of movement and change, but here within the granite walls there was only the eternal and the still. He felt a deep sense of belonging. He was the mason of the western slope, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The rain continued its steady and percussive dance, and the wind began to die down into a soft and sighing whisper. The candle burned low, and the shadows in the room grew deeper and more profound. Julian felt the first stirrings of the final rest. It was a slow and inevitable pull, a transition from the world of the senses to the world of the spirit. He adjusted his position, and he felt the straw of the pallet rustle beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the mountain. He was ready to let go of the day. He was ready to find the stillness that lay at the heart of the stone. The candle on the small stone shelf had burned down to a mere nub of tallow, and the flame was a tiny and dancing point of amber light in the center of the deep shadows. Elder Julian watched the flicker with a steady and unblinking gaze, and he felt the immense stillness of the Abbey pressing in on him from every side. The room was no longer a separate space, but a part of the mountain itself, and the granite walls seemed to vibrate with the low and rhythmic pulse of the earth. He felt the weight of the library above him, and the depth of the foundation below, and he knew that the work he had done that day was a vital part of the whole. The wall was true, and the bond was solid, and the masonry was resting in the center of its own gravity. He moved his hand to the edge of the straw pallet, and he felt the rough and dry texture of the bedding. It was a simple and honest material, and it carried the scent of the summer fields and the high pastures. He adjusted his position, and the straw rustled with a sound like the movement of the wind through the dry stalks of the grain. He felt the tension leaving his lower back and the heaviness in his thighs, and he allowed his body to sink into the support of the pallet. His muscles were tired, but it was a quiet and satisfying fatigue that came from a day of meaningful labor. He was the mason, and his body was the instrument of the stone, and now the instrument was being returned to its case. The rain outside had settled into a constant and meditative drone, and the sound was a comfort to his spirit. He could hear the water as it traveled down the exterior of the granite walls, and he imagined the way the moisture was sealing the gaps in the fourth course of the wall. The rain was a binder of its own, a liquid element, that connected the minerals of the rock to the minerals of the soil. Julian felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that the mountain was taking over the work. The wall was no longer his alone. It was now a part of the natural order, and it would stand firm against the storms of the coming century. He breathed in the cool and damp air of the cell, and he felt the freshness of the rain filling his lungs and calming his heart. He looked up at the ceiling where the shadows were moving in a slow and hypnotic dance. The light of the candle was fading and the darkness was beginning to reclaim the corners of the room. He did not feel the need for light. He knew every inch of the cell by touch, and he felt the presence of the stones even in the absence of the sun. The granite was a silent and unyielding companion, and it gave him a sense of absolute security. He felt as though he were lying in the very heart of the mountain, protected by miles of earth and the ancient wisdom of the builders. He was rooted and he was safe, and he was exactly where he belonged. His thoughts began to drift like the mist in the valley below the western slope. He saw the faces of the stones he had shaped that day, and he felt the tactile memory of the hammer and the chisel in his palms. He saw the dark basalt and the gray limestone and the reddish sandstone, and he felt the beauty of their intersection. He thought about Brother Elias in the garden and Master Silas in the woodshop, and he felt the connection between their labors. They were all part of the same ritual, and they were all working toward the same goal of peace and restoration. The Abbey was a living entity, and every act of creation was a prayer for the stillness of the world. The darkness in the cell was now almost complete, and the only sound was the steady and percussive rhythm of the rain. Julian felt his heartbeat slowing to match the cadence of the storm, and his breath becoming a low and constant whisper in the quietude. The boundary between his body and the pallet and the stone wall was starting to disappear. He was becoming a part of the architecture of the night. He felt the immense and grounding power of the earth pulling him down into a state of deep and restorative rest. There was no more need for action and no more need for thought. The work was done and the foundation was set, and the mason was ready to find his own silence. He pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders, and he felt the warmth of the fabric spreading through his limbs. The wool was thick and coarse, and it smelled of the high sheep folds and the natural oils of the flock. It was a comforting and familiar scent, and it added another layer to the sensory tapestry of the room. Julian closed his eyes, and he felt the weight of his eyelids as a final and welcome pressure. The darkness behind his eyes was a vast and open space where the images of the day began to dissolve into the formless peace of the night. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was resting in the center of his own creation. The rain continued to fall in a steady and melodic song, and the wind moved around the corners of the abbey with a soft and sighing breath. The mountain was at peace, and the stones were still, and the foundation was secure. Julian felt a profound sense of gratitude for the stillness and the weight and the silence. He was a part of the earth, and the earth was a part of him, and in the middle of the storm he found the ultimate quietude. The fatigue of the day was a warm and heavy sea that was now carrying him away from the shores of the world. He was drifting into the deep and ancient rest of the mineral kingdom. He adjusted his head on the pallet, and he felt the last of the tension leaving his neck and his jaw. He was completely still, and his mind was a clear and empty space. There was only the sound of the rain, and the feel of the wool, and the presence of the granite. The world outside the abbey was a distant and forgotten memory, and the only reality was the peace of the cell. He was the mason, and he was the stone, and he was the foundation. He was the rooted strength of the western slope, and he was finally letting go of the day. The candle flickered one last time, and then the flame went out, leaving the room in a state of absolute and velvet darkness. Julian did not move. He did not need to see the world to know that it was true. He felt the immense and silent power of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment, and he allowed himself to sink into the final and deepest layer of the quietude. The ritual of the masonry was complete, and the ritual of the rest was beginning. He was a man of the earth, and he was returning to the earth in the center of the night. And in that quietude he slept. The descent from the high quarry began with a slow and deliberate gathering of the ropes. Elder Julian stood at the very lip of the excavation where the jagged gray walls of the mountain fell away into the steep and forested incline of the western slope. The 2 slate capstones were now secured to a low and heavy sledge made of aged ash wood. The sledge was a simple tool, but it was a veteran of many seasons, and the runners were polished to a mirror finish by the constant friction of the mountain paths. Julian took a long coil of heavy hemp rope and he began to wrap it around a massive and ancient pine tree that stood as a silent sentry at the head of the trail. This was the snubbing post. It was the anchor that would allow him to control the immense weight of the stone as it surrendered to the pull of gravity. He wrapped the rope 3 times around the thick bark of the pine, and he felt the rough and resinous texture of the tree against his palms. His hands were dark and powerful, and the fine blue dust of the slate had settled into every crease of his skin, making his knuckles look like carved pieces of the mountain itself. He braced his legs and he took the strain of the sledge into his shoulders. The wood groaned under the pressure of the 2 slabs, and for a moment the air was filled with the scent of stressed timber and old earth. Julian exhaled a long and steady breath, and he allowed the first inch of the rope to slide through his grip. The sledge moved forward with a deep and grinding vibration that seemed to resonate in the center of his chest. The path was narrow and winding, and it was covered in a thick carpet of damp pine needles and moss. The rain from the previous night had made the ground soft and unpredictable, and Julian had to calculate every step with the precision of a mathematician. He moved in a slow and rhythmic cadence. Step and brace and release. Step and brace and release. The rope moved through his hands with a controlled and steady friction, and the heat from the fibers began to warm his skin. He did not fight the weight of the stone. He used the mountain itself to counter the pull. He used the trees and the boulders and the natural curves of the trail to manage the momentum of the sledge. As he moved deeper into the forest, the light began to change. The open and silver sky of the high quarry was replaced by a soft and emerald gloom. The canopy of the pines was so thick that only the most persistent rays of sunlight could find their way to the forest floor. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of wet cedar and decaying leaves, and the sound of the distant storm was replaced by the intimate rustle of the wind in the needles. Julian felt a profound sense of peace in the shelter of the trees. He was no longer a figure etched against the sky. He was a part of the living shadows. He felt the presence of the small creatures of the woods, the squirrels and the mountain birds, as they watched his slow and heavy progress with a quiet curiosity. The physical toll of the descent was immense. Every muscle in Julian's back and arms was pulled tight like the strings of an instrument, and the sweat began to carve dark channels through the dust on his forehead. He did not stop to rest. He knew that the rhythm was his greatest ally, and to break it would be to invite the fatigue to settle into his joints. He moved with a grace that masked the struggle. He was a man who understood the limits of his own body, and he knew how to find the hidden reserves of strength that lay beneath the surface of the skin. He felt the steady pulse of his heart, and the deep and resonant flow of his breath, and he knew that he was in harmony with the task. He reached a section of the trail where the incline became particularly steep, and the path narrowed to a sliver of rock and dirt. Here the mountain seemed to lean out over the valley, and the depth of the forest below was a dizzying expanse of green. Julian stopped for a moment to reassess the anchor. He found a massive boulder that was embedded deep in the hillside, and he used it as a pivot point for the rope. He leaned his weight back, and he felt the immense tension of the sledge pulling at his core. The slate slabs were silent, but they were demanding everything he had to give. He watched as the runners of the sledge bed into the soft earth, and he felt the shift in the balance of the load. He adjusted his grip, and he allowed the rope to slide another 6 inches. The sound of the masonry was different here in the woods. In the open quarry, the strike of the hammer was a sharp and echoing report, but here the grinding of the sledge was a muffled and organic sound. It was a low and heavy rumble that seemed to belong to the mountain itself. Julian listened to the voice of the wood and the stone, and he knew that they were settling into the journey. The sledge was no longer an alien object. It was a part of the path. He moved around a sharp bend in the trail, and he saw the roofs of the Abbey appearing through the mist below. The library was a dark and solid silhouette against the gray of the valley, and he felt a sudden surge of motivation. The capstones were almost home. He passed the boundary of the woodshop, and he smelled the sharp and sweet scent of cedar shavings and linseed oil. He knew that Master Silas was likely at his bench shaping the grain of the pines just as he was shaping the grain of the mountain. He did not look toward the shop, but he felt a sense of companionship in the shared labor. They were the builders of the Abbey, and they were the keepers of the Quietude. Julian moved past the garden where the scent of wet herbs and rich soil rose up to meet him, and he saw the flash of a white robe in the distance. Brother Elias was tending to the green, and Julian felt a silent nod of respect pass between them in the center of the Quietude. The final stretch of the descent was a long and gentle slope that led directly to the western slope terrace. Julian allowed the sledge to pick up a small amount of speed, using the rope only to guide the direction of the movement. The ash runners hissed over the wet grass, and the sound was a soft and soothing coda to the heavy labor of the morning. When the sledge finally came to a halt at the base of the wall, Julian let go of the rope, and he stood perfectly still. He felt the blood rushing back into his hands, and the slow release of the tension in his shoulders. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the earth and the slate, but he was satisfied. He walked to the edge of the sledge, and he looked at the two slabs of slate. They were raw and powerful, and they carried the essence of the high quarry within their mineral hearts. They had survived the journey, and now they were ready for their final purpose. Julian reached out, and he touched the cold surface of the stone, and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the grain. He looked at the wall, and he saw the four corpses waiting for their protectors. The ritual of the descent was over, and the ritual of the crowning was about to begin. He sat down on his observation rock, and he watched as the first thin rays of the afternoon sun began to break through the clouds, casting a golden light over the masonry and the stone. The sun had moved to a position where the shadows of the Abbey library were long and pointed like the fingers of a giant reaching across the terrace. The air was warm and still, and the scent of the wet earth from the morning was replaced by the dry and metallic smell of the masonry. Elder Julian stood before the four completed courses of the wall, and he looked at the massive slate capstones resting on the ash sledge. To any other man, the task of moving these slabs to the top of the structure would have seemed an impossibility of weight and gravity, but to Julian it was simply a matter of the right leverage and the patient application of the mechanical laws. He was not a man who fought the earth. He was a man who used the rules of the earth to achieve his ends. He walked to the edge of the terrace where three massive poles of seasoned oak were leaning against the rock face. These were the legs of his tripod, the ancient machine of the lift. Each pole was as thick as his thigh, and they were polished to a dull glow by years of use and the constant friction of the ropes. Julian gathered the poles, and he began the slow and rhythmic process of the assembly. He stood the first two legs upright, and he lashed them together at the top using a length of heavy hemp rope that was as thick as his thumb. He did not use a simple knot. He used a series of intricate and overlapping wraps that distributed the tension across the entire surface of the wood. The wood groaned under the pressure of the rope, and the sound was a deep and satisfying creak that echoed off the library walls. He added the third leg, and he moved the tripod into position over the center of the wall. He spent a long time adjusting the feet of the oak poles, ensuring that they were seated firmly in the grit and the soil. He used his heavy mallet to tap the base of each leg until the tripod was a singular and unyielding pyramid of strength. He stood back and he looked at the structure, and he felt the immense stability of the wood. It was a bridge between the earth and the sky, a temporary monument to the ritual of the lift. He reached into his tool rack and he pulled out the heavy iron pulley block. The metal was dark and cold, and it carried the scent of heavy grease and old labor. He hooked the block to the lashing at the top of the tripod, and he watched as it dangled in the still air, a silent and powerful weight. Julian took the long coil of hoisting rope and he began to thread it through the iron sheaves. He worked with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands moved with a grace that masked the power in his shoulders. His palms were dark and textured like the bark of the ancient pines, and the fine blue dust of the slate was visible in the deep lines of his knuckles. He felt the rough and fibrous surface of the rope against his skin, and he welcomed the friction. It was a tactile connection to the task, a physical reminder of the forces he was about to engage. Once the rope was threaded, he brought the end down to the ash sledge, and he began the process of the slinging. He used two wide straps of heavy canvas to wrap the first slate capstone. He did not rush this part of the ritual. The sling had to be placed exactly at the center of the stone's gravity, or the slab would tilt and slide once it left the ground. Julian ran his hands over the edges of the slate, feeling for the hidden balance of the mineral. He moved the straps an inch to the left, and then a fraction of an inch back to the right until he felt the stone settle into the embrace of the canvas. He hooked the rope to the slings, and he took up the slack, and he felt the first hint of the resistance. The slate was heavy and unyielding, and it held onto the sledge with a stubborn and ancient persistence. The lifting began with a slow and steady pull. Julian did not use his back to move the stone. He used the weight of his own body, leaning his entire mass into the rope and allowing the pulley to do the work of the transformation. He felt the tension traveling up through his legs and settling in his core, and he breathed deep into his belly. The air was thick with the scent of the mountain, and the steady pulse of his heart was a constant and calming rhythm in the silence of the terrace. The sledge made a soft and dry sound as the weight of the slate was removed, and then the capstone was in the air. It moved with a slow and majestic grace, ascending toward the top of the wall inch by inch. As the stone rose, the tripod began to sink. The oak legs vibrated under the immense pressure, and the rope made a high and rhythmic sound as it moved through the iron sheaves. It was a song of physics and labor, a melody of the masonry that Julian had heard 1,000 times before. He did not look up at the stone. He kept his eyes on the ground and his focus on the tension of the rope. He was the anchor, and he was the engine of the lift. He felt the sweat beginning to carve channels through the dust on his forehead, and the pull in his forearms was a warm and heavy ache. He welcomed the fatigue. It was a sign of his engagement with the material, a physical evidence of his presence in the center of the work. When the capstone reached the level of the fourth course, Julian stopped the pull. He wrapped the hoisting rope around a heavy snubbing post he had driven into the earth, and he felt the weight of the stone transfer from his body to the timber. The slate dangled just inches above the wall, and it moved slightly in the cooling afternoon breeze. Julian walked to the structure, and he reached out a hand to steady the stone. The slate was cold and solid, and it carried the vibration of the lift within its grain. He began the delicate process of the alignment. He did not use his strength to move the stone now. He used the weight of the stone itself, nudging the edges of the slab until it was perfectly centered over the bond of the masonry. He took his wooden lever, and he inserted the tip beneath the edge of the slate. He moved with a quiet and precise focus, his hands dark against the gray of the limestone. He lifted the front edge of the capstone just a fraction, and he reached for a final set of shims. These were thin slivers of lead that he had cast in the Abbey workshop, and they were designed to provide a soft and yielding bed for the heavy slate. He placed the lead shims on the top course of the wall, and he watched as the capstone settled into position. There was a deep and muffled thud as the stone met the masonry, a sound of immense finality that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his boots. The weight was home. The protector was set. Julian unhooked the slings, and he watched as the canvas straps fell away from the stone. The capstone sat on the wall with a majestic and unshakable presence, and the gray slate looked like a natural part of the mountain slope. He stood back and he looked at the progress of the hour. The wall was nearly complete. The foundation was buried and the courses were bonded, and now the first of the capstones was in place to shed the rain and the snow. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. He had taken the heart of the mountain, and he had lifted it to the sky, and he had given it a new purpose in the order of the Abbey. He moved back to the tripod, and he prepared for the second lift. The rhythm of the work was a meditation, a long and slow conversation between the mason and the machine. He did not think about the end of the day or the fatigue in his joints. He only thought about the next wrap of the rope and the next placement of the sling. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting a golden and amber light over the terrace, and the sound of the pulley was a steady and comforting song in the center of the quietude. The second capstone hung in the balance of the tripod, and the cooling afternoon air was thick with the scent of distant cedar and the dry mineral dust of the terrace. Elder Julian knelt on the gritty surface of the fourth course, and his hands were steady as he reached for the small leather pouch at his waist. Within the pouch were the final shims of the day, and they were pieces of lead he had cast in the quiet of the Abbey foundry during the winter months. He pulled one out, and he felt the surprising weight and the soft and yielding texture of the metal. Lead was a patient material. It did not resist the stone like iron, and it did not rot like wood. It sat between the layers of the masonry as a silent diplomat, and it allowed the immense weight of the slate to settle into the limestone without creating a point of fracture. Julian inserted his wooden lever beneath the leading edge of the capstone, and he applied a measured pressure. He slid the first shim into place, and he felt the tactile resistance of the slate as he allowed the lever to lower the weight. He did not let go of the stone immediately. He kept his palm flat against the cold surface, and he waited for the vibration to settle. He was listening with his skin. He was feeling for the moment when the capstone became one with the courses below it. In his mind he saw the wall as a vertical map of time. The foundation at the bottom was the past, and the courses in the middle were the present, and the capstones were the future. They were the protectors that would ensure the library remained dry and the knowledge remained safe for the generations of brothers who were not yet born. He felt a deep sense of responsibility in this final adjustment. He was the one who determined the slant and the level and the stability of the entire enterprise. His hands were dark and powerful, and the skin was mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 different stones. He looked at the contrast between the deep tone of his forearms and the pale gray of the limestone, and he felt a profound sense of belonging to the mountain. He was not an intruder on the slope. He was a participant in its slow and geologic transformation. He moved his lever to the rear edge of the capstone, and he lifted the weight once more. The sound of the oak against the slate was a low and groaning protest, and it echoed off the high walls of the library like a whispered secret. Julian reached for a second shim, and he placed it with a precision that was born of decades of silence. He was not rushing the end of the day. He was savoring the finality of the work. As the second shim took the weight, he felt a shift in the balance of the tripod. The hoisting rope slackened, and the iron pulley made a soft and metallic click as the tension was released. Julian stood back, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the two capstones sitting side by side, and he saw the way they bridged the gap between the inner and outer faces of the wall. They were the crowns of the masonry. They were the ending of the sentence. He thought about Brother Elias in the garden, and he imagined the keeper of the Quietude looking up at the wall and seeing the progress of the mason. He thought about Master Silas and the way the woodcarver would appreciate the flush edges and the true lines of the slate. They were a trio of the earth, and each of them contributed a different layer to the rooted strength of the Abbey. Julian knelt again to check the batter of the wall one final time. He used his plumb line, and he watched the lead weight as it dangled in the center of the terrace. The inward lean was perfect. The wall was pressing toward itself, and it was using gravity as a source of strength rather than a source of decay. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest, and he allowed himself a moment of internal celebration. The wall was no longer just a project or a task, it was a reality. It was a physical manifestation of his will and his patience. He reached for a small container of fine sand, and he began to sprinkle it into the tiny gaps between the capstones. He used his fingertips to work the sand into the joints, and he felt the grit against his skin as a final blessing of the masonry. The shadows of the library were now touching the edge of the forest, and the light was turning into a deep and vibrant amber. Julian stood in the center of the terrace, and he allowed the stillness of the afternoon to wrap around him. He thought about the stones he had moved from the high quarry, and the way they had felt in the descent, and the way they now looked in the setting sun. He felt the immense and grounding presence of the Abbey behind him, and he knew that the library was secure. The capstones would shed the rain, and the shims would hold the weight, and the wall would stand as a silent sentinel on the western slope. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he had fulfilled his purpose for the season. He gathered his lever and his shims, and he placed them back in his leather pouch. He felt the fatigue in his knees and the heavy ache in his lower back, but it was a good and honest tiredness. It was the fatigue of a man who had built something that would outlast his own breath. He looked at his hands, and he saw the blue dust of the slate, and the pale dust of the limestone, and the dark red of the clay. They were the colors of his life, and he wore them with a quiet and profound pride. He was ready for the cleansing of the tools and the simplicity of the evening meal. He was ready for the rest that comes from the center of the work. He took a final look at the wall, and he reached out to touch the cold slate one last time. He felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the grain, and he felt the steady and reliable pulse of the earth beneath his feet. He was at peace. The masonry was complete, and the spirit of the wall was true. He turned away from the terrace, and he began the slow walk toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was leaving the work in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the watch. The sun had finally surrendered its last amber light to the encroaching purple of the evening, and the western slope was now a world of deep shadows and cool air. The finished wall stood as a dark and powerful presence on the edge of the terrace, and the two capstones looked like the resting wings of the great bird. Elder Julian stood at the center of his workspace, and he looked at the tools that had served him through the long hours of the ritual. The hammer and the chisels and the iron bars were scattered across the flat rock, and they were coated in the fine blue dust of the slate and the pale grit of the limestone. They were tired and they were worn, and they were ready for the restoration of the night. Julian reached for a heavy roll of dark canvas, and he spread it out on the surface of the observation rock. He moved with a slow and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the mountain. He picked up the broad-faced chisel first, and he felt the immense weight and the cooling temperature of the steel. The edge of the tool was slightly dulled by the resistance of the volcanic rock, and the surface was marked by the friction of the day. Julian took a thick square of coarse wool, and he dipped it into a jar of refined linseed oil. The scent of the oil was sharp and earthy, and it filled the air with a sense of preservation and care. He began the cleaning of the steel. He moved the wool in a slow and circular motion, and he watched as the oil lifted the dust from the grain of the metal. He worked the oil into the corners and the ridges of the chisel, and he felt the vibration of the friction in his fingertips. His hands were dark and textured, and the oil made the skin of his palms gleam in the fading light. He was not just cleaning a tool, he was honoring a partner. He thought about the specific strikes that had shaped the limestone, and the way the steel had found the hidden heart of the granite. The chisel was an extension of his own body, and he treated it with the same reverence he gave his own limbs. Once the steel was clean and oiled, Julian took a fine whetstone, and he began the ritual of the sharpening. He held the chisel at a precise angle, and he moved it across the stone with a steady and even pressure. The sound was a low and rhythmic hiss, a melody of the masonry that spoke of the upcoming work of the next season. He did not rush the process. He waited until he felt the edge of the tool becoming true and sharp once more. He wiped the steel with a dry cloth, and he placed the chisel on the canvas rack. It looked like a new thing now, a silver and silent promise of the future. He moved on to the heavy hammer. The iron head was scarred and pitted by the thousands of impacts it had delivered, and the wooden handle was dark and polished by the oils of his own skin. Julian wiped the iron with the oiled wool, and he felt the immense solidity of the tool. He checked the head for any signs of loosening, and he tightened the wedge with a single and measured strike of his palm. He spent a long time cleaning the handle of the hammer. He worked the linseed oil into the grain of the ash wood, and he felt the material becoming supple and strong once more. He looked at the handle, and he saw the history of his own hands written in the dark and polished surface. Every grip and every swing had left a mark, and he welcomed the evidence of his own presence in the work. The iron bars were the next to be cleaned. They were long and heavy, and they carried the scent of the high quarry within their cold metal. Julian wiped them down with the oil, and he felt the weight of the descent still lingering in his shoulders. He removed the grit from the tips, and he checked the length of the iron for any bends or fractures. The bars were the bones of his craft, and he respected their unyielding nature. He wrapped them in a separate piece of heavy canvas, and he secured the bundle with a leather cord. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and he felt the stillness of the Abbey wrapping around him like a familiar garment. The iron pulley and the hemp ropes were the final items to be tended. Julian wiped the iron sheaves with the oiled cloth, and he checked the movement of the block. It spun with a smooth and silent rotation, and the metal gleamed in the dim light. He began the coiling of the ropes. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and he allowed the hemp to settle into a series of perfect and overlapping loops. The rope was rough and fibrous, and it carried the scent of the mountain wind and the pine resin. Julian felt the texture against his palms, and he thought about the tension of the lift and the way the tripod had sunk under the weight of the slate. He secured the coil with a simple and honest knot, and he placed the rope in a protective wooden box. As the last of the tools was cleaned and stored, Julian stood up and he stretched his back. He felt the pull of the muscles in his chest and his arms, and he welcomed the fatigue. It was a good and honest tiredness, a physical testament to a day of meaningful labor. He looked at the workspace, and he saw the order he had restored. The rocks were covered and the tools were wrapped, and the terrace was ready for the night. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the completion of the cycle. He had built the wall, and he had cared for the instruments, and now he was ready to care for himself. He walked to the stone basin near the edge of the slope, and he dipped his hands into the cold rainwater. The water was dark and silver in the starlight, and it felt like a sudden and cooling blessing against his skin. He washed away the oil and the dust and the grit of the masonry, and he watched as the water became cloudy with the history of the day. He splashed the rain over his face and his neck, and he felt the weight of the mountain lifting from his spirit. The scent of the rain was fresh and clean, and it filled his heart with a sense of renewal. He dried his hands with a linen cloth, and he looked at his palms. They were dark and powerful, and they were ready for the silence. He took a final look at the wall. The capstones were silent sentinels in the darkness, and the spirit of the masonry was true. He felt a deep connection to the Abbey and the library and the brothers who were resting within the granite walls. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he had fulfilled his purpose. He turned away from the terrace, and he began the slow walk toward the entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the center of the quietude. He was leaving the work in the hands of the mountain, and he knew that the stones were safe. My apologies for the confusion. I definitely want to make sure we hit that 30,000 character mark so your narrator has exactly what they need for the 30-minute duration. I will focus on making this final section exceptionally dense and detailed to bridge the gap between the tool cleansing and the final rest. We will follow Julian from the wash basin to the high balcony of the library to view the finished wall from above before he finally retires to his cell for the night. The courtyard of the Abbey was a world of silver and shadow, and the air was filled with the rhythmic dripping of the rain from the slate eaves. Elder Julian moved with a slow and measured gait, and his boots made a soft and heavy sound against the wet cobblestones. He did not go directly to his cell. Instead, he turned toward the stone staircase that wound its way up the exterior of the library. He felt the pull in his thighs and a steady ache in his lower back, but he welcomed the physical effort. He wanted to see the work from a different perspective. He wanted to witness the way the walls sat within the landscape now that the capstones were in place, and the spirit of the masonry was true. He reached the high balcony that overlooked the western slope, and he stood perfectly still. The wind was a cool and constant presence, and it carried the scent of the high pines and the damp mineral earth. Below him the terrace was a dark and mysterious expanse, and the wall he had built was a solid and unyielding ridge of shadow. In the pale light of the rising moon, the gray slate of the capstones seemed to glow with an internal fire. They looked like a natural outcropping of the mountain, and they fit the contour of the slope with a perfect and ancient grace. Julian felt a deep sense of connection to the structure. From this height, he could see the way the wall protected the foundation of the library, and he understood the immense importance of the labor. The stone was the silent guardian of the scrolls and the protector of the knowledge and the anchor of the Abbey. He leaned his hands against the stone railing, and he felt the immense solidity of the building beneath his palms. He thought about the contrast between the stone and the parchment. Inside the library were thousands of scrolls made of thin and fragile material, and they carried the thoughts and the prayers of the brothers. They were light, and they were susceptible to the decay of time and the moisture of the air. But the stone was different. The stone was the physical manifestation of the eternal. It was the unyielding reality that allowed the fragile wisdom to exist. Julian saw himself as a servant of that relationship. He was the one who provided the stability and the permanence and the rooted strength. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his work was the bridge between the fleeting breath of the man and the infinite silence of the earth. The moon moved higher in the sky and the shadows on the terrace began to shift and transform. Julian watched the way the light played over the surface of the capstones, and he saw the fine texture of the slate. He imagined the way the rain would flow over the edges of the stone, and he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in the geometry of the work. Every angle and every joint and every shim was a part of a larger harmony. The wall was not just a collection of rocks. It was a prayer in mineral form. It was a testament to the patience of the spirit and the honesty of the gravity. He felt the stillness of the Abbey wrapping around him like a familiar garment, and he allowed the quietude to settle into the marrow of his bones. He remained on the balcony for a long time, simply being present in the center of the night. He did not think about the fatigue in his joints or the weight of the stones he had moved from the high quarry. He only thought about the resonance of the masonry and the steady pulse of the mountain. He felt a deep sense of belonging. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The world outside the Abbey was a place of noise and distraction, but here within the circle of the stone there was only the peace of the ritual. He took a final look at the wall, and he felt the spirit of the masonry reaching up to meet him. The work was complete, and the foundation was secure, and the mountain was at rest. He turned away from the balcony, and he began the slow descent toward his cell. The stone staircase was dark and cool, and the sound of his footsteps was a soft and rhythmic cadence in the silence. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and he felt the transition from the world of the light to the world of the shadows. He reached the heavy oak door of his cell, and he pushed it open with a slow and steady pressure. The room was filled with the scent of old dust and dry straw, and the air was perfectly still. He did not light a candle. He moved through the darkness with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and cooling presence of the granite walls. He removed his damp undershirt, and he felt the sudden release of the moisture against his skin. His body was dark and powerful, and the muscles were etched with the labor of the masonry. He took a dry cloth and he wiped away the final traces of the day. He felt the texture of the linen against his palms, and he welcomed the sensation of the cleanliness. He was a part of the earth, but he was also a separate and conscious entity, and the ritual of the washing was a way of reclaiming his own self. He sat on the edge of the straw pallet, and he allowed his gaze to drift to the narrow window. The moon was a silver disk in the center of the dark sky, and the rain had finally ceased its percussive dance. The silence of the cell was absolute. There was no sound but the slow and rhythmic pulse of his own heart, and the distant sighing of the wind in the pine trees. Julian felt the immense weight of the fatigue settling over him, and he allowed his mind to drift like the clouds over the high quarry. He saw the faces of the stones, and he felt the vibration of the hammer and the texture of the slate. He thought about the lift and the descent and the final placement of the capstones. He felt the beauty of the order and the perfection of the bond. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the stone he found his ultimate peace. He lay back on the pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his chin. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the summer, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He felt the warmth of his own body spreading through the bedding, and he allowed the darkness to wrap around him. He was no longer a figure of labor or a man of action. He was a part of the foundation. He was the silent and unyielding center of the Abbey. He felt the immense and grounding power of the earth pulling him down into a state of deep and restorative rest. The work of the season was done, and the spirit of the wall was true, and the builder was finally ready to find his own silence. The darkness in the cell was a velvet and absolute reality, and the world outside was a distant and forgotten memory. Julian closed his eyes, and he felt the weight of his eyelids as a final and welcome blessing. He was drifting into the deep and ancient rest of the mineral kingdom. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was rooted in the heart of the Abbey. The mountain was at peace, and the stones were still, and the foundation was secure. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was finally letting go of the day. And in that quietude, he slept. The completion of the library wall had brought a temporary stillness to the western slope, but Elder Julian was not a man built for long periods of inactivity. For a mason, the end of one project is simply the foundation for the next, and the Abbey was a living organism that always required the attention of the stone. After a week of heavy rain that had settled the new wall into the mountain, Julian received word from the abbot that the old well near the eastern cloister had begun to fail. The timber lining of the shaft, which had been placed nearly a century ago, was finally surrendering to the constant moisture and the pressure of the earth. The task was clear and it was formidable. Julian was to replace the wood with a permanent lining of dry stone and build a protective well house above it to ensure the purity of the water for the generations to come. He began the first day by standing at the edge of the old well, and he felt the immense and cooling presence of the water far below. The air in the cloister was different from the air on the western slope. It was trapped within the high stone arches and the thick ivy, and it carried the scent of wet slate and old incense and the cold mineral tang of the deep earth. Julian knelt on the damp grass, and he placed his hands on the rim of the well. He felt the vibration of the abbey around him, a steady and reliable pulse that spoke of the continuity of the monastic life. The water was the lifeblood of the community, and to work on the well was to work on the very heart of the abbey. The first ritual of the new project was the clearing of the circle. Julian took a long length of hemp rope and a heavy iron spike, and he began to map out the footprint of the well house. He drove the spike into the center of the old well, and he used the rope as a compass to draw a perfect circle in the dark and fertile soil. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the cloister. He was not just marking the ground, he was establishing the boundary of the sacred space. The circle was the symbol of the eternal and the unbroken, and it was the only shape that could truly withstand the pressure of the mountain. Once the circle was drawn, Julian began the excavation. He used a short-handled spade to remove the top layer of the turf, and he worked with a meticulous care to preserve the roots of the nearby ivy. The soil was rich and black, and it smelled of ancient things, of decayed leaves, and the slow transformation of the mineral world. As he dug deeper, he encountered the first of the old timbers. They were dark and heavy with the moisture of 100 years, and they crumbled under the touch of his hands like old bread. Julian removed the rotted wood with a sense of quiet reverence. It had served its purpose, and it had protected the water for a lifetime, and now it was returning to the earth to make room for the stone. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, Julian had cleared the first 5 feet of the shaft. The walls of the excavation were raw and damp, and they revealed the different layers of the mountain's history. He saw the red clay of the upper slope, and the dark veins of the coal, and the gray grit of the limestone. He felt the temperature of the earth dropping as he moved deeper, and the air became thick with the scent of the deep minerals. He was no longer a figure of the light. He was a participant in the darkness of the foundation. He looked up at the circle of the sky above him, and he saw the white clouds moving across the blue void like silent ships. The world was vast and open, but here in the earth there was only the stillness and the weight. He began the process of the shoring. Before he could place the first of the lining stones, he had to ensure that the walls of the shaft would not collapse under their own pressure. He used a series of heavy oak planks to create a temporary frame, and he wedged them into place using small blocks of granite. He worked with a precision that left no room for error. A single shift in the soil could lead to a breach, and the well would be lost to the mountain. Julian listened to the sound of the earth as he worked. He heard the small trickles of moisture, and the soft rustle of the grit, and the low and heavy groan of the mountain as it adjusted to the new void. He was the listener of the stone, and he understood the language of the pressure. He placed the stone against the wall of the shaft, and he felt the subtle resistance of the earth. In a dry stone well, there is no mortar to glue the pieces together, and there is no iron to hold the structure firm. The masonry relies entirely on the honesty of the weight and the perfect marriage of the shapes. Julian turned the basalt stone over in his hands, and he felt for the bed. He positioned the stone so that it overlapped the joint of the 2 stones below it, creating a bond that would lock the courses together. He used a small wooden mallet to tap the stone into place, and the sound was a short and heavy report that echoed off the clay walls. He did not rush the movement. He waited until he felt the stone settle into the embrace of the circle. The work in the narrow shaft was a meditation on the limit of space. Julian had to keep his movements compact and his focus sharp, as there was no room for error or for wasted energy. He felt the pull in his shoulders and the steady ache in his core as he moved from stone to stone, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence. The dust from the basalt was a fine and dark powder that coated his hands and turned the skin of his forearms into a map of the mountain's history. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the grit had settled into the deep lines of his skin. He was a man of the earth, and he was becoming a part of the structure he was building. As the second and third courses began to rise, the scale of the task became clear. Julian was not just lining a well. He was building a vertical foundation for the water of the Abbey. He had to consider the batter of the lining, which was the subtle inward lean that would ensure the stones were constantly pressing toward the center of the circle. If the walls were perfectly vertical, the pressure of the earth would eventually push them inward and the well would collapse. But a wall with a true batter uses the weight of the mountain as a source of strength. Julian used a short plumb line to check the angle of every course, and he adjusted the shims with a quiet and meticulous care. He found a section of the shaft where the clay was particularly soft, and the water from the previous night's rain had created a pocket of mud. This was a point of danger for the masonry, as the soil could shift and create a void behind the stones. Julian did not ignore the flaw. He took a handful of small and jagged flint chips, and he began to pack them into the soft earth. He used his mallet to drive the flint deep into the clay, creating a solid and unyielding hearting that would support the basalt. He worked with a patient and focused intensity, and he felt the resonance of the mountain through the tools. He was the listener of the pressure, and he understood that the silence of the earth was never empty. By the time the fourth course was complete, the sun had reached the center of the sky, and the light was pouring directly into the well. The basalt glowed with a dull and honest light, and the red clay looked like a vibrant and ancient tapestry. Julian sat back on his heels, and he took a slow and measured drink of water from his skin. The water was cold, and it tasted of the mountain, and it gave him a sense of renewal and strength. He looked at the circle he had built, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the builders who had come before him. They had stood in the same earth, and they had handled these same stones, and they had felt the same weight in their bones. He was a part of a long and unbroken line of masters who understood that the only way to build for the future was to respect the past. He reached for the next bucket of stones, and he began the process of the fifth course. The stones were getting larger now as he moved closer to the water table where the pressure of the earth was at its greatest. He selected a massive binder of dark basalt, and he felt the immense weight of the mineral as he lifted it from the bucket. He had to use his entire body to guide the stone into position, and he felt the strain in his legs and his lower back. He placed the binder across the joint, and he felt the finality of the placement. The stone was home. It was a bridge of weight that would hold the lining firm for 100 years. The first of the lining stones were brought to the cloister on the ash sledge. They were small and flat pieces of dark basalt, each one selected for its density and its resistance to the water. Julian took the first stone and he lowered it into the shaft using a simple rope harness. He followed the stone down, and he knelt in the cool and dark center of the well. He felt the dampness of the earth through the fabric of his robes, and the sting of the cold air on his skin. He placed the basalt stone against the wall of the shaft, and he felt the weight of the mountain pressing against his back. This was the moment of the first ring, the point where the stone began to reclaim the void and the well began to find its permanent form. He worked in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving a tapestry of the earth. He did not use mortar to hold the lining stones in place. He relied on the arch effect, the natural pressure of the circle that turned every stone into a binder for its neighbor. He placed the stones with the bed facing outwards so that the weight of the mountain would only serve to tighten the bond. He used small slivers of slate to shim the joints, and he felt the grit against his skin as a final blessing of the masonry. The ring began to rise inch by inch, a dark and unyielding ridge of volcanic rock in the middle of the red clay. The physical toll of the work in the shaft was different from the labor on the terrace. There was no room for the long swing of the hammer or the full extension of the arms. The movements were compact and intense, and they required a high level of concentration and balance. Julian felt the pull in his core and the steady ache in his knees, and he welcomed the intimacy of the task. He was in the heart of the Abbey, and he was touching the very source of its life. He thought about the water that would eventually flow through this stone, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the future. The well would stand long after the library wall was gone, and it would provide the refreshment for the brothers of the next century. As the first ring was completed, the light in the cloister began to turn into a deep and vibrant gold. The sun was beginning its descent, and the shadows of the arches were stretching across the grass like long and dark fingers. Julian stood in the center of the well, and he looked at the work of the day. The basalt was dark and silent, and it carried the vibration of the mountain within its grain. The circle was true, and the bond was solid, and the foundation of the well was set. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. He had taken the first step toward the restoration of the heart, and he had established the boundary of the deep silence. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass for a long moment, simply being present in the stillness of the cloister. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant tolling of the evening bell. Julian looked at the circle he had drawn in the earth, and he saw the promise of the well house. It would be a structure of beauty and strength, a monument to the patience of the stone and the permanence of the abbey. He felt the fatigue in his joints, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning returned with a heavy and silver light that seemed to cling to the high arches of the eastern cloister. Elder Julian stood at the rim of the well, and he looked down into the dark and narrow throat of the earth. The first ring of basalt was settled and firm, and the volcanic rock looked like a dark and silent crown resting in the red clay. But a single ring was only a promise of stability, and the true strength of the well lay in the repetition of the circle. To build a lining that would withstand the pressure of the mountain for centuries, Julian had to ensure that every stone was a part of a singular and unyielding arch. He gathered his leather harness and his heavy hemp ropes, and he prepared for the descent into the deep silence once more. He lowered himself into the shaft with a slow and rhythmic motion, and his boots found purchase on the narrow ledge of the basalt. The air in the well was cold, and it carried the scent of wet minerals and ancient water, and the heavy smell of the undisturbed earth. Julian knelt in the center of the circle, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the mountain all around him. He was a figure of the shadows now, and the light from the sky above was a small and distant disk of white. He reached for the first stone of the second course, which had been lowered down to him in a canvas bucket. It was a flat and heavy piece of basalted surface, rough and pitted by the volcanic fires of the past. The shadows in the shaft began to lengthen as the afternoon sun moved toward the western peaks. Julian continued the work with a rhythmic and steady pace, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving the very fabric of the earth. He reached the point in the excavation where the red clay gave way to the gray grit of the limestone, and he felt the temperature of the air drop even further. He was nearing the aquifer, the source of the lifeblood of the abbey. He could hear the faint and distant sound of the water moving through the rock, a soft and rushing whisper that spoke of the deep silence. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The well was rising, and the heart of the abbey was being restored. He stopped the work for a moment to look up at the circle of the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear in the blue void, and the air was cooling rapidly. He felt the fatigue in his joints and the heavy ache in his muscles, but it was a good and honest tiredness. He had built 5 courses of the lining, and the circle was true, and the bond was solid. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. He began the slow climb out of the shaft, and he felt the relief of the open air and the wide horizon. He stood on the damp grass of the cloister, and he looked at the well, and he felt the presence of the stone. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant tolling of the evening bell. Julian gathered his tools, and he cleaned them with a dry cloth, and he felt the smooth and polished surface of the wood, and the cold and hard edge of the steel. He was ready for the rest of the night, and the simplicity of the evening meal. He was ready for the silence. He took a final look at the well, and he reached out to touch the cold rim of the basalt. He felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the grain, and he felt the steady and reliable pulse of the earth. The work was not finished, but the foundation was secure, and the masonry was true. He walked toward the abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the stone he found his ultimate peace. He thought about the stones that were yet to be laid and the well house that was yet to be built, and he felt a deep sense of purpose. The Abbey was a living entity, and he was the one who ensured its stability and its permanence. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he was the listener of the stone. And in that quietude he moved toward the rest. The air at the bottom of the shaft was no longer just cold, it was heavy with the moisture of the deep mountain. The red clay had given way to a layer of gray silt and fine gravel, and the sound of the world above had been replaced by the rhythmic and insistent seep of the aquifer. Elder Julian stood at the very base of the excavation, and he felt the water as it began to pool around the soles of his heavy leather boots. It was not a sudden flood but a slow and patient arrival, as if the mountain were finally allowing its secret lifeblood to be seen by the light of the man. The water was cold, and it carried a sharp mineral tang that spoke of its long journey through the limestone, and the flint, and the deep veins of the mountain bone. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, and he listened to the voice of the spring. It was a low and constant whisper, a sound of movement, and life that had been hidden in the darkness for an eternity. He began the process of the filter course. This was the most technical and sensitive part of the well lining, for it was here that the masonry had to be both a wall and a gate. He reached for the first of the filter stones, which he had sorted into a separate pile on the cloister grass. These were not the dark basalt blocks he used for the upper lining, but small and polished river stones he had gathered from the bed of the Abbey stream during the dry months of the previous summer. Every stone was smooth and rounded by the passage of time, and they were entirely free of the fine grit and the clay that could cloud the purity of the well. Julian knelt in the cold pool, and he began to lay the first course of the bed. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands were dark and powerful against the silver surface of the rising water. He placed the river stones in a thick and interlocking layer across the floor of the shaft. He was creating a porous foundation that would allow the water to rise through the gaps while keeping the heavy mountain soil from clogging the intake. He did not use his hammer for this task. He used only his hands, feeling for the way the smooth surfaces of the stones could be wedged together to create a stable and unyielding floor. The water moved around his fingers, and it carried away the final traces of the red clay from his skin. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the moisture made his skin gleam like the wet granite of the high quarry. He felt a deep sense of connection to the element. The water was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was a companion in the labor. Once the filter bed was settled, Julian began the first course of the intake wall. This required a specific kind of masonry that he called the gap bond. Every 3 stones of basalt he left a small and deliberate void, a precise gap that would serve as a gateway for the rising spring. These were the weep holes, and they were the secret of a healthy and lasting well. Julian adjusted the placement of the basalt with a meticulous care, ensuring that the gaps were large enough to allow the flow of the water, but small enough to prevent the silt of the mountain from entering the shaft. He used tiny slivers of slate as shims to maintain the spacing, and he felt the grit of the stone against his skin as a final blessing of the work. As the first course of the intake wall was completed, he felt the pressure of the water beginning to equalize. The pool around his boots was now nearly 4 inches deep, and the sound of the seep had changed from a whisper to a steady and rhythmic gurgle. Julian watched as the water flowed through the weep holes, and he saw the way it carried the silver light of the sky down into the darkness. He thought about the concept of the bridge. The well was a bridge between the world of the light and the world of the deep silence, and the weep holes were the doors that allowed the transition to happen. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The masonry was true, and the bond was solid, and the water was finding its way home. The second and third courses of the intake wall required larger and heavier binders of dark basalt to ensure that the pressure of the aquifer would not push the lining inward. Julian reached for the heavy rope, and he signaled to the brothers above to lower the next bucket of stone. He felt the vibration of the pulley, and he watched as the massive binders descended through the narrow circle of the sky. He caught the first of the stones, and he felt the immense weight of the volcanic rock as it settled into his arms. He was working in a space that was now entirely wet, and the stone was slick and cold in his grip. He braced his legs against the walls of the shaft, and he guided the binder into its position over the weep holes of the first course. The physical toll of the work in the water was immense. The cold of the pool was beginning to seep through the leather of his boots, and the dampness of the air was settling into his robes. Julian did not allow the discomfort to distract him. He focused on the rhythm of the masonry and the steady flow of his own breath. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his body was the anchor of the project. He felt the pull in his core and the heavy ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the fatigue. It was the price of the restoration. He was giving his own strength to the earth, and in return the earth was giving him the gift of the water. He placed the second binder, and he felt the finality of the placement. The ring of the intake was rising, and the well was becoming a singular and unyielding entity. By the time the fourth course of the intake wall was complete, the sun had moved to a position where it was no longer shining directly into the shaft. The light was soft and blue, and it cast long and liquid shadows across the basalt masonry. Julian sat back on his heels in the cold water, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the circle he had built, and he saw the way the stones were beginning to disappear beneath the surface of the rising pool. The water was now nearly a foot deep, and it was clear and pure and filled with the memory of the mountain. He reached down, and he scooped a handful of the water to his lips. It was the coldest and cleanest thing he had ever tasted, and it carried the essence of the deep minerals and the ancient silences. He thought about the centuries of rain that had fallen on the high quarry, and the way the moisture had traveled through the limestone and the flint to reach this point. Every drop was a traveler, and every drop was a part of the history of the Abbey. Julian felt a profound sense of reverence for the cycle. He was not just building a well, he was participating in the eternal movement of the earth. He was the one who provided the vessel for the water, and the water was the one that gave life to the vessel. He felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that the well would remain long after his own name was forgotten. It was a monument to the patience of the stone and the permanence of the spring. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower of the Abbey, and the sound traveled down the shaft as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final climb of the day. He looked at the intake wall, and he saw the way the weep holes were performing their silent duty. The water was rising steadily, and the silt was being held back by the filter bed, and the spirit of the well was true. He felt a quiet sense of triumph. The most difficult part of the restoration was complete, and the foundation of the heart was secured. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass of the cloister, feeling the warmth of the evening air against his skin. He took a final look at the circle in the earth, and he saw the silver reflection of the first stars in the water below. The mountain was at rest, and the stones were still, and the spring was finding its way to the surface. Julian was tired, and his robes were stained with the red clay and the dark dust of the basalt, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was leaving the well in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the rise. The water at the bottom of the well was no longer a shallow pool, but a steady and rising presence that reflected the small circle of the sky far above. Elder Julian stood on the narrow ledge of the intake wall, and he felt the immense and cooling weight of the mountain pressing against the outside of the basalt lining. He was now transitioning from the porous filter section to the solid structural shaft, and the work required a shift in both his rhythm and his focus. Every stone he placed now had to be a perfect seal against the red clay and the shifting silt of the mountainside. He reached for the heavy hemp rope that dangled in the center of the well, and he felt the vibration of the pulley as the next bucket of masonry was lowered into the darkness. The stones for the middle shaft were a dense and gray limestone which Julian had selected for their strength and their ability to lock together in a tight and unyielding embrace. He took the first of the limestone blocks from the bucket, and he felt the cold and slightly chalky texture of the mineral against his dark palms. The stone was heavy and solid, and it carried the scent of the high quarry and the memory of the sun. Julian knelt on the wet basalt, and he began the process of the second bond. He placed the limestone over the joint of the intake binders, and he felt for the bed of the masonry. He was looking for the point where the stone would sit perfectly flush without the need for a shim or a wedge. He moved with a quiet and deliberate intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the shaft. The air in the well was thick with the smell of wet minerals and old earth, and the sound of the rising water was a constant and comforting whisper. Julian used a heavy iron hammer to tap the limestone into place, and the sound was a deep and resonant report that traveled up through the shaft and out into the cloister. He did not strike with his whole arm. He moved from the wrist and the elbow, keeping his movements compact and efficient in the narrow space. He was the listener of the stone, and he understood the way the vibration changed when the bond was true. As the first course of the limestone lining began to take shape, Julian felt the shift in the pressure. The wall was no longer a separate collection of rocks. It was becoming a singular and organic entity. He worked in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving the very fabric of the mountain. He ensured that the batter of the lining was consistent, using his short plumb line to check the inward lean of every stone. The circle was the strongest shape in the world, and Julian treated it with a quiet and profound reverence. He was not just building a lining for a well, he was participating in the eternal geometry of the earth. One of the most critical aspects of the shaft masonry was the backfill ritual. As the limestone lining rose, Julian had to fill the gap between the stone and the raw earth of the excavation. He used a mixture of small river pebbles and coarse mountain sand to create a drainage layer that would allow the moisture to flow down to the intake without putting undue pressure on the wall. He reached for a separate bucket of the fill, and he began to pour the pebbles into the void behind the limestone. The sound was a bright and crystalline rattle, a chorus of mineral voices finding their places in the darkness. He used a long wooden rammer to pack the backfill down, and he felt the vibration of the impact in the marrow of his bones. He was ensuring that there were no air pockets and no hidden voids where the frost could take root. The backfill was the secret strength of the well. It was the cushion that protected the masonry from the movement of the mountain, and the anchor that held the circle in place. Julian worked with a meticulous care, and his hands were dark and textured against the pale gray of the limestone. He looked at the way the grit and the dust had settled into the fine lines of his skin, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his work was the bridge between the world of the light and the world of the deep silence. By the time the third course of the limestone was complete, the light in the well had begun to turn into a soft and emerald green. The sun was moving across the sky, and the reflections of the ivy from the cloister arches were dancing on the surface of the water. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the circle he had built, and he saw the way the stones were beginning to glow with an internal light. The well was no longer a dark and frightening void. It was a sanctuary of sound and stone. He reached down, and he touched the surface of the rising pool, and he felt the cool and silver energy of the spring. The water was clear and pure, and it was a testament to the honesty of the masonry. The fourth and fifth courses of the shaft required the placement of the key binders. These were massive and long pieces of limestone that were intended to span the entire width of the lining and lock into the surrounding earth. They were the anchors of the shaft, and they required an immense amount of physical strength and technical precision to place. Julian signaled to the brothers above, and he watched as the first of the binders descended through the narrow circle of the sky. The stone was nearly 3 feet long, and it moved with a slow and majestic grace, and it looked like a silver cloud in the center of the darkness. Julian caught the binder, and he felt the strain in his shoulders and his core as he guided the weight into position. He had to brace his legs against the walls of the shaft and use the strength of his entire body to maneuver the stone. He placed the binder across the joint of the limestone courses, and he felt the finality of the placement. The stone was home. It was a bridge of mineral strength that would hold the lining firm for generations. He used his chisel to dress the edges of the binder, ensuring that it fit perfectly within the curve of the circle. The sound of the metal against the stone was a high and rhythmic song, a melody of the masonry that echoed through the cloister. The physical toll of the work in the shaft was starting to settle into his joints, but Julian did not allow the fatigue to distract him. He focused on the steady flow of his own breath and the rhythmic movement of the bucket. He was the engine of the restoration, and his body was the anchor of the project. He felt the pull in his thighs and the heavy ache in his lower back, and he welcomed the sensation. It was the evidence of his presence in the center of the work. He was giving his own vitality to the mountain, and in return the mountain was giving him the sense of permanence. He placed the second binder, and he watched as the ring of the shaft rose another 6 inches. As the evening approached, the air in the well became colder, and the sound of the evening bell began to toll from the high tower of the Abbey. Julian stood in the center of the well, and he looked at the progress of the day. He had built 5 courses of the limestone lining, and the circle was true, and the bond was solid. He was now nearly 10 feet below the surface of the cloister, and the walls of the shaft were a dark and powerful ridge of earth and stone. He felt the stillness of the Abbey wrapping around him like a familiar garment, and he allowed the quietude to settle into his heart. He thought about the water that would eventually fill this shaft, and the way it would provide the refreshment for the brothers of the next century. He was not just building a well, he was participating in the long and unbroken history of the Abbey. He felt the presence of the masters who had come before him, and he felt the promise of the masters who were yet to be born. The stone was the silent witness to the passage of time, and the well was the vessel of the lifeblood. He reached out, and he touched the limestone wall, and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the grain. He was at peace. The work was difficult, and the environment was harsh, but the spirit of the masonry was true. He gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final climb of the day. He looked at the limestone lining, and he saw the way the light of the first stars was reflecting in the water below. The mountain was at rest, and the stones were still, and the well was finding its permanent form. Julian was tired, and his robes were stained with the gray dust of the limestone and the dark silt of the mountain, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass of the cloister, feeling the warmth of the evening air against his skin. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant sighing of the pine trees. Julian took a final look at the circle in the earth, and he saw the silver reflection of the sky in the water. He was leaving the well in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the watch. He walked toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the stone he found his ultimate peace. The first stars were now visible through the intricate stone tracery of the cloister arches, and the air was filled with the cool and fragrant scent of the night-blooming jasmine. Elder Julian reached for the final rung of the wooden ladder, and he pulled himself out of the dark throat of the well. The transition from the subterranean dampness to the open air of the Abbey was a sudden and sensory revelation. He stood on the damp grass, and he felt the immense and open sky above him and the steady and reliable ground beneath his feet. His robes were heavy with the moisture of the aquifer, and his skin was stained with the dark silt of the mountain, but he did not feel the cold. He felt the warmth of the achievement, and the quiet and profound satisfaction of the completed lining. The final task of the masonry was the placement of the curved stone. This was the massive and singular ring of gray granite that would sit at the very top of the shaft and provide the threshold between the world of the light and the world of the water. It was the crown of the well, and it was the protector of the spirit. Julian moved to the edge of the cloister, where the granite ring was resting on a bed of soft sand. The stone was nearly 5 feet in diameter and several inches thick, and it had been carved from a single block of the mountain bone during the previous season. The surface was smooth and polished, and it carried the fine and silver grain of the granite. He gathered his tripod and his heavy iron pulley, and he began the process of the final lift. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a slow and constant sound in the silence of the night. He worked by the light of the moon and the soft glow of the Abbey lanterns, and he felt the presence of the mountain all around him. He lashed the oak poles together, and he threaded the hemp rope through the iron sheaves, and he felt the vibration of the machine as it found its balance. This was the most delicate lift of the entire project, for the curved stone had to be perfectly centered over the shaft to ensure the stability of the upper well house. Julian used 4 wide canvas straps to cradle the granite ring, and he took up the slack in the hoisting rope. He leaned his mass into the pull, and he felt the immense weight of the stone as it left the sand. The granite moved with a slow and majestic dignity, and it looked like a silver moon ascending toward the sky. Julian did not look at the stone. He kept his eyes on the ground and his focus on the tension in the rope. He was the anchor, and he was the engine of the ritual. He felt the pull in his core and the heavy ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the fatigue. It was the evidence of his commitment to the heart of the Abbey. When the curbed stone was suspended over the mouth of the well, Julian stopped the lift. He moved to the edge of the shaft, and he reached out a hand to steady the granite. The stone was cold and solid, and it carried the vibration of the lift within its grain. He began the process of the final knuckling. He used a series of lead shims to adjust the height of the stone, ensuring that the surface was perfectly horizontal. He checked the level with a shallow bowl of water, and he watched as the liquid settled into a still and perfect mirror. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The threshold was true, and the masonry was solid, and the well was finally sealed against the mountain. Once the curbed stone was settled, Julian removed the straps and the tripod, and he stood alone at the rim of the well. He took a small wooden bucket made of aged cedar, and he tied it to a fresh length of hemp rope. He began the ritual of the first draw. He lowered the bucket into the dark and narrow shaft, and he listened to the sound of the rope as it traveled over the granite edge. The bucket descended through the layers of the history he had built, passing the limestone lining and the basalt intake and the silver floor of the filter bed. He heard the splash as the wood met the water, and the sound was a short and hollow report that echoed through the cloister like a whispered greeting. He pulled the rope back with a steady and rhythmic motion, and he felt the weight of the water as it rose toward the light. When the bucket reached the surface, Julian caught it with a practiced ease, and he set it on the polished granite of the curbed stone. The water was clear and cold, and it carried the reflection of the stars in its dark and silver center. Julian reached down, and he dipped his cupped hands into the bucket. The water was the coldest and purest thing he had ever felt, and it carried the sharp and mineral essence of the deep earth. He brought the water to his lips, and he drank. It was a moment of profound communion. He was tasting the lifeblood of the mountain, and he was witnessing the success of the restoration. He stood in the center of the cloister, and he allowed the silence of the night to wrap around him. He thought about the brothers who would come to this well in the mornings to follow, and the way the water would provide the refreshment for the gardens and the kitchens and the cells. He was not just a builder of walls, he was a keeper of the spring. He felt a deep sense of belonging to the Abbey, and he felt the presence of the earth as a companion in the labor. The well was a testament to the patience of the spirit and the honesty of the masonry. It was a bridge of stone and a vessel of water, and it was a permanent anchor in the center of the Quietude. Julian gathered his tools, and he cleaned them with a slow and meticulous care. He oiled the steel of his chisels, and he wiped the handles of his hammers, and he coiled the ropes into perfect and overlapping loops. He moved with the quiet intensity of a man who was finishing a prayer. He checked the curbed stone one last time, feeling the smooth surface of the granite beneath his dark palms. The work was complete, and the site was clean, and the well was ready for the watch. He felt the fatigue of the day settling into his joints, and the warmth of the evening air against his skin, and he knew that it was time for the rest. He walked toward his cell, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence on the damp grass. He entered the small and sparse room, and he felt the cooling presence of the granite walls. He did not light a candle. He moved through the darkness with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and grounding weight of the Abbey pressing in on him. He removed his damp robes, and he dried his skin with a rough linen cloth. He felt the texture of the fabric against his knuckles and his palms, and he welcomed the sensation of the cleanliness. He was a man of the earth, but he was also a man of the spirit, and the ritual of the washing was a way of returning to his own center. He lay back on the straw pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the high quarry, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He closed his eyes, and he felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the marrow of his bones. He saw the circle of the well and the reflection of the stars and the rising of the water. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was rooted in the heart of the Abbey. The foundation was secure, and the masonry was true, and the builder was finally ready to let go of the day. The darkness in the cell was absolute, and the world outside was a distant and forgotten memory. Julian felt his heartbeat slowing to match the pulse of the mountain, and his breath becoming a low and constant whisper in the quietude. He was drifting into the deep and ancient rest of the mineral kingdom. He was the stone, and he was the water, and he was the silence. The ritual of the season was done, and the heart of the Abbey was restored, and the night was holding the watch. And in that quietude he slept. The first frost had arrived at the Abbey with a silent and silver precision that turned the ivy of the cloisters into a frozen tapestry of white. The air on the mountain was no longer the damp and mineral breath of the well, but a sharp and crystalline cold that signaled the true onset of the winter. Elder Julian stood in the center of the great refectory, and he looked at the massive stone hearth that dominated the northern wall. This was the hearth of the ancestors, and it had provided the warmth and the light for the brothers for over 3 centuries. But the years of constant heat and the weight of the massive oak logs had taken their toll. The back wall of the firebox was cracked, and the mortar had turned to a fine and gray dust, and the heavy stone lintel was showing signs of a dangerous fatigue. The heart of the Abbey's warmth was failing, and before the first deep snows arrived, Julian had to perform the ritual of the restoration of the flame. He moved his workspace into the great hall, and the environment was a stark contrast to the open slopes or the dark well. The air was dry and smelled of old wax and wood smoke, and the high vaulted ceilings swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Julian spread his heavy canvas drop cloths over the polished stone floor, and he began the process of the dismantling. He used a small and pointed iron bar to gently pry the cracked firebricks from the rear of the hearth. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and constant sound in the vast silence of the hall. He was not just removing old stone, he was clearing the path for the new heat. He felt the residual warmth of the stones even through the leather of his gloves, a memory of the thousands of fires that had burned in this space. He reached into the dark throat of the chimney, and he began to clear the soot and the debris that had gathered on the smoke shelf. The soot was a fine and velvet black powder that coated his hands and turned the skin of his forearms into a map of the shadows. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the soot was the physical evidence of the Abbey's history, and he treated it with a quiet and profound respect. He used a stiff brush to scrub the interior of the flue, and the sound was a rhythmic and dry rasp that echoed through the great hall. He was looking for the structural integrity of the stone. He was searching for the point where the masonry met the heat and the wind. The second ritual of the morning was the selection of the firebricks. Julian had spent the previous week in the Abbey foundry casting a series of specialized bricks made of a mixture of local clay and ground volcanic basalt. These were the sunstones, and they were designed to absorb the intense heat of the fire and radiate it back into the room long after the logs had turned to ash. He took the first of the sunstones from his wooden crate, and he felt the immense density and the smooth texture of the material. It was a deep and earthy red, a color that promised warmth and protection. He began to lay the first course of the new firebox, and he moved in a slow and rhythmic cadence. He used a thin and refined mortar made of fire clay and fine sand to bond the bricks. He did not use the heavy and coarse mortar of the exterior walls. The hearth required a delicate touch of masonry of the interior that was both strong and flexible. Julian applied the mortar with a small iron trowel, and he watched as the red clay settled into the joints. He placed the first brick at the center of the back wall, and he tapped it into place with a small wooden mallet. The sound was a short and muffled report that seemed to ground the entire room. He was building the shield of the flame, and he felt the weight of the responsibility in the center of his chest. As the courses of the fire bricks began to rise, Julian focused on the angle of the coping. The back wall of the great hearth must lean forward with a subtle and graceful curve to push the heat into the room and the smoke into the flue. Julian used his hands to guide the curve, feeling for the hidden geometry of the heat. He was the listener of the flame, and he understood the way the air moved through the stone. He placed the second and third courses with a meticulous care, ensuring that the overlaps were perfect and the joints were tight. The firebox was no longer a separate collection of bricks. It was becoming a singular and unyielding vessel for the light. The physical toll of the indoor work was different from the labor on the terrace. The air was still and the space was confined, and Julian felt the heat of his own exertion settling into his muscles. He felt the pull in his core and the steady ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the sensation. It was the evidence of his presence in the center of the restoration. He looked at his hands and he saw the contrast between the deep tone of his skin and the bright red of the fireplace. He felt a profound sense of belonging to the craft. He was the one who provided the stability and the warmth and the rooted strength of the Abbey. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his work was the bridge between the cold of the winter and the comfort of the fire. By the time the firebox was half complete, the light in the great hall had begun to turn into a soft and amber glow. The sun was moving across the high windows, and the reflections of the stained glass were dancing on the stone floor. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the hearth, and he saw the way the new stones were beginning to glow with an internal light. The hearth was no longer a cold and broken void. It was a sanctuary of sound and stone. He thought about the brothers who would gather here in the evenings to follow, and the way the fire would provide the warmth for their prayers and their conversations. He was not just building a fireplace. He was participating in the long and unbroken history of the community. He reached for the next course of bricks, and he began the process of the lintel support. The heavy stone lintel above the hearth was a massive piece of gray granite, and it carried the weight of the entire chimney breast. Julian had to ensure that the new firebricks provided a solid and unyielding foundation for the weight. He used a series of small lead shims to adjust the height of the bricks, and he checked the level with a meticulous eye. He was building for the pressure of the mountain and the heat of the fire. He felt the vibration of the Abbey through the stones, and he knew that the foundation was secure. The heart of the flame was being restored, and the masonry was true. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the great hall as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final rest of the day. He looked at the hearth, and he saw the way the red bricks were holding the light of the afternoon sun. The ritual of the restoration was well underway, and the spirit of the flame was being invited back into the stone. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the red clay and the black soot, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the hearth, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the exit, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. The morning light filtered through the high, narrow windows of the great refectory, casting long and dusty beams across the polished stone floor. Elder Julian stood before the hollowed-out shell of the hearth of the ancestors, and he felt the immense silence of the hall wrapping around him. The vertical walls of the new firebox were settled and firm, but the most critical component of the restoration was still waiting at the edge of the workspace. This was the great hearthstone, a singular and massive slab of gray granite that would form the floor of the fireplace. It was the shield that protected the Abbey from the hunger of the flame, and the anchor that held the entire structure to the earth. He began the process of the bedding. Before the granite could be moved into its permanent home, Julian had to prepare the foundation of the floor. He used a small shovel to spread a thick layer of fine mountain sand across the base of the hearth. The sand was cool and dry, and it carried the scent of the high peaks and the ancient minerals. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands were dark and textured against the pale grit. He used a wooden straightedge to level the sand, ensuring that there were no ridges or hollows that could create a point of tension beneath the stone. He was building for the weight of the mountain and the heat of the fire, and he understood that the smallest grain of sand could determine the stability of the century. Once the bed was leveled, Julian turned his attention to the granite slab. The stone was nearly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, and it carried a thickness of nearly 5 inches. It was a beautiful piece of mineral history with flecks of silver mica that caught the morning light like trapped stars. To move such a weight, Julian used a series of short wooden rollers made of seasoned oak. He placed the rollers beneath the leading edge of the granite, and he used a heavy iron pry bar to coax the stone forward. The sound was a low and heavy rumble of vibration that traveled through the soles of his boots and settled in his marrow. He did not rush the movement. He was the listener of the weight, and he understood that the stone would only move when it was ready to surrender its inertia. The transition from the rollers to the sand bed was the most delicate part of the ritual. Julian braced his legs against the masonry of the firebox, and he applied a steady and measured pressure to the pry bar. He felt the muscles in his arms and his back tightening with the effort, and the sweat began to carve channels through the fine black soot on his forehead. He guided the granite slab as it slid off the last roller and settled onto the sand. The sound was a deep and muffled thud, a resonance of finality that seemed to anchor the entire great hall. The stone was home. It was no longer a separate entity. It was now the floor of the flame. Julian knelt in the dust, and he began the process of the seating. He used a heavy wooden mallet to tap the edges of the granite, ensuring that the stone was perfectly seated within the sand. He moved in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his breath was a constant and calming sound in the silence. He was listening for the resonance of the strike. A hollow sound would mean an air pocket was hidden beneath the stone, and a sharp ring would mean a point of tension. He waited until he heard the deep and solid thud that spoke of a perfect union. He was satisfied. The hearthstone was one with the earth, and it was ready to take the heat of the coming winter. The final adjustment of the hearthstone required the use of the water level. Julian took a shallow ceramic bowl and he filled it to the brim with clear mountain water. He placed the bowl at the center of the granite slab and he watched the surface of the liquid. The water was a silent and honest witness to the geometry of the work. If the bowl showed a slight tilt, he would use a lead shim to raise the stone. Julian moved with a quiet and meticulous care, and his hands were dark against the silver grain of the granite. He found a minute discrepancy at the northern corner, and he used his pry bar to lift the slab just a fraction of an inch. He slid a thin sliver of lead beneath the stone, and he watched as the water in the bowl settled into a still and perfect mirror. The hearthstone was now perfectly horizontal, a flat and unyielding plane of strength. This was more than just a technical requirement for Julian. It was a matter of the spirit. A hearth that was not level would eventually crack under the heat, and a spirit that was not balanced would eventually break under the pressure of the world. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The foundation of the warmth was true, and the masonry was solid. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the keeper of the balance. With the stone leveled, Julian began the final dressing. He took a small and pointed chisel, and he began to refine the edge of the granite where it met the firebricks of the firebox. He worked with a quiet and intense focus, and the sound of the metal against the stone was a high and rhythmic song that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory. He was removing the rough edges and the jagged protrusions, ensuring that the joint was tight and the spirit of the masonry was clean. The dust from the granite was a fine and silver powder that coated his fingers and turned his knuckles into a landscape of mineral history. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the grit. He saw the scars from the flint and the calluses from the granite, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was not just building a fireplace. He was building a testament to the patience of the man and the permanence of the Abbey. He thought about the brothers who would sit on this hearthstone in the years to follow, and the way the stone would hold the heat and provide the comfort. He was a part of their future, and they were a part of his legacy. The stone was the bridge between the generations, and he was the one who built the crossing. As the afternoon light began to fade, Julian gathered his tools and he prepared for the final cleaning of the workspace. He used a soft brush to remove the dust from the surface of the hearthstone, and he felt the smooth and cool texture of the granite beneath his palms. The stone was ready. The floor of the flame was set, and the firebox was rising, and the heart of the Abbey was being restored. He felt the fatigue in his joints, and the heavy ache in his lower back, but it was a good and honest tiredness. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He took a final look at the hearthstone, and he reached out to touch the silver flecks of mica one last time. He felt the vibration of the Abbey through the stone, and he felt the steady and reliable pulse of the earth. The ritual of the foundation was complete, and the ritual of the flame was waiting. Julian walked toward the exit of the great hall, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was leaving the hearth in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the rise. The preparation of the mortar was a ritual of the earth and the water, and it required a level of patience that few men outside of the Abbey could ever truly understand. Elder Julian stood at the center of the great refectory, and he looked at the 3 wooden barrels that held the raw ingredients for the heat-resistant bomb. This was not the standard lime and sand mixture he used for the exterior walls of the library. A hearth of this magnitude required an alchemy of the fire clay, and the volcanic ash, and the fine silica sand. Julian reached into the first barrel, and he pulled out a handful of the red mountain clay. It was dry and crumbly, and it carried the scent of the deep veins of the mountain bone. He allowed the clay to slide through his fingers, and he felt the immense potential for the transformation. He began the process of the sifting. Before the clay could be mixed with the water, it had to be refined to a state of absolute purity. Julian used a fine mesh screen made of copper wire, and he began to pass the clay through the small and regular openings. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the hall. The dust from the clay rose in small and pale clouds, and it settled into the fine lines of his knuckles and the dark creases of his palms. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the dust was a sign of the work, and he treated it with a quiet and profound reverence. He watched as the red powder gathered in the bottom of the mixing tub, and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the mineral. Next he added the volcanic ash. This was the material that would give the mortar its ability to expand and contract without cracking under the intense heat of the flame. The ash was a deep and velvet gray, and it was as fine as the soot from the chimney throat. Julian mixed the ash with the clay, and he used a long wooden paddle to stir the 2 minerals together. The sound was a soft and dry rustle, a melody of the masonry that spoke of the ancient fires of the mountain. He added the final ingredient, which was the silica sand. The sand was clear and sharp, and it provided the structural skeleton for the bomb. Julian spent a long time ensuring that the proportions were perfect, for the mortar of the hearth had to be both a servant and a master of the flame. The addition of the water was the final and most sensitive part of the ritual. Julian used a small ceramic pitcher to pour the water from the new cloister well into the mixing tub. He did not add it all at once. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and he watched as the dry minerals began to absorb the moisture. The scent of the wet earth rose up to meet him, a fresh and metallic fragrance that filled the great hall with a sense of renewal. He used his bare hands to mix the mortar, and he felt the resistance of the clay as it transformed into a thick and yielding paste. The texture was smooth and heavy, and it clung to his skin with a persistent and cooling weight. Julian worked the mixture until it was the consistency of heavy cream, and then he allowed it to rest. This was the slaking, and it was the moment where the minerals and the water became a singular and unyielding entity. While the mortar was ripening, Julian turned his attention to the great lintel. This was the massive beam of gray granite that would span the width of the firebox and carry the weight of the entire chimney breast. It was the brow of the hearth, and it was the most dangerous stone to move in the entire project. Julian stood before the lintel, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the mineral. The stone was nearly 8 feet long, and it was etched with the fine and silver grain of the granite. To lift such a weight within the confines of the refectory, Julian had to build a temporary scaffold of seasoned oak and heavy iron levers. He began the process of the bracing. He placed 2 massive oak pillars on either side of the hearth, and he used a series of wooden wedges to lock them into the floor. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence. He was building the skeleton of the lift, and he treated every joint and every wrap of the rope with the same care he gave to the stone itself. He used a heavy hemp rope to lash the lintel to a series of iron hooks, and he felt the tension in his own body as he prepared for the movement. He was the anchor of the project, and his muscles were the engine of the transformation. The lift began with a slow and steady pressure. Julian did not use the strength of his arms alone. He used the weight of his entire body, leaning his mass into the long iron lever. He felt the resistance of the gravity and the stubborn inertia of the granite. The oak scaffold began to sing under the pressure, and the wood made a high and rhythmic sound that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory. Julian did not rush the movement. He moved the lintel inch by inch, and he watched as the stone rose toward the top of the firebox. He was the listener of the weight, and he understood the way the tension changed when the balance was true. As the lintel reached the level of the supporting pillars, Julian felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room. The air was thick with the scent of the stressed wood, and the dry mineral dust, and the salt of his own exertion. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, and he looked at the stone. The granite was suspended in the center of the hall, and it looked like a silver cloud in the middle of the shadows. Julian moved to the back of the scaffold, and he began the delicate process of the seating. He had to guide the massive beam into the notches he had carved in the side walls of the firebox. He used the wooden lever to nudge the edge of the lintel, and he felt the tactile resonance of the stone as it met the masonry. He did not let go of the lever immediately. He kept his focus on the joints, and he felt for the hidden balance of the structure. He took a handful of the ripened fireclay mortar, and he spread it over the top of the supporting stones. The mortar was cool and heavy, and it felt like the pulse of the mountain against his skin. He lowered the lintel onto the bed of clay, and he watched as the weight of the granite squeezed the excess mortar from the joints. The sound was a deep and muffled thud, a resonance of finality that seemed to anchor the entire hearth to the earth. Julian stood back and he looked at the progress of the ritual. The lintel was home. The brow of the hearth was set, and the firebox was complete, and the heart of the abbey was ready for the heat. He felt the fatigue in his joints, and the heavy ache in his lower back, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the red clay and the gray granite dust. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he had restored the strength of the flame. The great lintel stood as a silent sentinel over the newly restored hearth, and the silver grain of the granite seemed to absorb the flickering amber light of the abbey lanterns. The stone was set, and the mortar was slaking in the joints, but to Julian the hearth was not yet finished. It was a functional structure of weight and heat, but it lacked the spiritual anchor that would connect it to the centuries of brothers who had sat before this flame. Every major piece of masonry in the abbey carried the mark of the ancestors, and the restoration of the great refectory hearth required the same silent and permanent witness. Julian reached for his smallest leather roll, which he kept for the fine work of the inscription, and he felt the immense stillness of the hall settled in the marrow of his bones. He began the ritual of the mapping. Before a single strike of the hammer could be delivered, Julian had to establish the geometry of the mark. He took a small piece of white limestone chalk and he began to trace the symbol onto the center of the granite lintel. The mark of the abbey was a stylized mountain peak set within a perfect circle, and it represented the intersection of the eternal earth and the infinite sky. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the vast silence of the hall. He used a wooden compass and a straight edge to ensure that the proportions were true, and he felt the rough and crystalline texture of the granite beneath the chalk. The process of the tracing was a meditation on the history of the order. As Julian drew the lines, he thought about the first mason who had carved this mark into the foundation stones of the library, and the way the symbol had survived the frost and the wind of 300 winters. He was not just drawing a shape, he was reconnecting the hearth to the lineage of the mountain. He looked at the white lines against the dark gray of the stone, and he felt a quiet spark of satisfaction. The mark was centered and balanced, and it sat upon the brow of the fireplace like a silent blessing. He wiped the chalk dust from his fingers, and he felt the grit of the mountain as a final seal of the preparation. The carving began with the selection of the wasp-tailed chisel. This was a short and tapered tool of hardened steel that Julian had forged specifically for the fine relief work on the granite. He took a small boxwood mallet, and he moved into the center of the hearth. He did not stand on a ladder. He knelt on the great hearthstone he had laid the day before, and he felt the immense and grounding stability of the floor beneath his knees. He placed the tip of the chisel on the outer edge of the circle, and he delivered the first strike. The sound was a high and rhythmic ring, a silver melody that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory and announced the beginning of the transformation. Julian worked with a precision that left no room for error. Granite is a stubborn and unforgiving material, and a single strike that was too heavy could cause a fracture in the grain of the stone. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and his hands were dark and powerful against the silver gray of the lintel. He was not removing large pieces of the mineral. He was etching the history into the stone. He used the chisel to create a shallow V-shaped groove, and he watched as the fine silver powder of the granite began to fill the lines of the mark. He felt the vibration of the steel in the palm of his hand, and he understood that the stone was finally beginning to accept the will of the mason. The physical toll of the carving was different from the heavy labor of the lift. It required a constant and intense focus that drained the energy of the mind as much as the strength of the body. Julian felt the pull in his forearms and the steady ache in his neck as he leaned forward to inspect the depth of the cut. He did not rush the movement. He was the listener of the grain, and he waited for the stone to reveal its secrets. He used a soft brush to clear the dust from the groove, and he felt the smooth and cold surface of the granite beneath his fingertips. The mark was starting to emerge from the stone, a shadow of the mountain in the middle of the abbey. Once the outline of the symbol was established, Julian moved to the relief work. He began to carve away the background of the circle to make the mountain peak stand out in a bold and powerful silhouette. This was the most time-consuming part of the ritual, for it required thousands of small and precise strikes to achieve an even depth across the surface of the granite. Julian moved his mallet in a rhythmic and melodic cadence, and the sound of the steel against the stone was a constant and calming presence in the hall. He was the focus point of the transformation, and his entire world was reduced to the space between the chisel and the grain. The dust from the carving was a fine and brilliant powder that coated his dark skin and turned his knuckles into a landscape of mineral history. He looked at the contrast between the deep tone of his arms and the silver white of the granite dust, and he felt a profound sense of connection to the mountain. He was a man of the earth, and he was giving his own vitality to the stone to ensure that the memory of the abbey remained permanent. He thought about the brothers who would look at this mark during the long winter evenings, and the way the symbol would provide a point of focus for their prayers. He was building a bridge of the spirit, and the granite was the medium of the crossing. By the time the sun had reached the western horizon, the relief work was nearly complete. The mountain peak stood out from the lintel with a majestic and unshakable presence, and the circle was a perfect and unbroken boundary. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the mark, and he saw the way the shadows of the evening were settling into the grooves of the stone. The symbol looked as though it had always been a part of the granite, as though the mountain had been waiting for the mason to reveal its hidden face. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. The heart of the abbey was now not only restored in its function, but also in its spirit. The final part of the carving was the polishing. Julian took a piece of fine grit sandstone and a small amount of oil, and he began to rub the surface of the mark. He moved in a slow and circular motion, and he felt the texture of the granite changing from the rough and jagged surface of the carving to a smooth and lustrous finish. The oil brought out the deep and rich colors of the mineral, and the silver mica began to gleam with a new and vibrant energy. He worked the oil into the grooves of the mountain peak, and he watched as the symbol began to glow in the dim light of the great hall. He spent a long time ensuring that the edges of the mark were sharp and the background was even. He used a linen cloth to wipe away the excess oil, and he felt the immense finality of the work. The mark was done. The brow of the hearth was no longer a blank and silent stone. It was a testament to the history and the continuity of the abbey. Julian stood up, and he stretched his back, and he felt the release of the tension in his shoulders. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the gray dust and the black soot, but he was satisfied. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he had fulfilled his purpose for the day. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the refectory as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final rest. He looked at the mark on the lintel one last time, and he felt the vibration of the stones still lingering in his palms. The ritual of the carving was complete, and the ritual of the fire was waiting. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the exit, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk, and he knew that the stones were ready for the flame. The great refectory was a vast and silent cathedral of shadow as the final light of the evening faded from the high windows and the silver frost began to thicken on the exterior of the stone walls. Elder Julian stood before the newly restored hearth of the ancestors, and he felt the immense stillness of the abbey settling into the marrow of his bones. The fire bricks were set, and the great granite lintel was carved and the hearthstone was leveled, but the masonry was still cold, and the fireclay mortar was heavy with the moisture of the preparation. Before the heart of the Abbey could be truly returned to the community, Julian had to perform the ritual of the first curing fire. This was the slow and patient awakening of the stone, a gentle introduction of the heat that would ensure the permanence of the bond. He began the process of the ignition. He reached for a small bundle of dry cedar shavings and several thin splints of mountain pine which had been seasoned in the high woodshop of Master Silas for over 3 years. The wood was as light as a feather, and it carried the sharp and sweet scent of the forest and the ancient resins. Julian knelt on the great hearthstone, and he placed the tinder in the center of the firebox. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the hall. He was not just building a fire, he was inviting the spirit of the warmth to return to the stone. He felt the cold texture of the granite beneath his knees, and he welcomed the immense stability of the foundation he had built. He took a small iron striker and a piece of gray mountain flint, and he delivered a single and measured blow. A tiny and brilliant spark fell into the center of the cedar shavings, and for a long moment the refectory was perfectly still. Then a thin and silver ribbon of smoke began to rise, and the scent of the burning wood filled the air with the fragrance of memory and renewal. Julian watched as the spark became a glow, and the glow became a small and dancing flame of amber light. He added the pine splints one by one, and he watched as the fire began to take hold of the mineral world. It was not a roar of heat, but a low and steady warmth, a gentle and constant energy that was designed to penetrate the heart of the masonry without causing a fracture. The mortar in the joints of the fire bricks was still damp, and the intense heat of a large fire would turn the moisture into steam and shatter the work of the season. The curing fire had to be a master of the patience. Julian sat back on his heels, and he watched as the amber light of the flame played over the surface of the new bricks and the silver grain of the lintel. He saw the shadows settling into the deep grooves of the ancestors' mark, and he felt the presence of the centuries of brothers who had sat before this same hearth. The stone was absorbing the heat, and the moisture was being driven out in a slow and invisible mist. Julian was the guardian of the transition, and he understood that the silence of the stone was never empty. As the fire grew to a steady and reliable bed of coals, the air in the great hall began to change. The sharp and crystalline cold of the frost was pushed back by a soft and radiant energy that felt like the pulse of the mountain itself. Julian reached out, and he touched the edge of the hearthstone, and he felt the first hints of the warmth. It was a subtle and living sensation, a physical evidence of the restoration. He thought about the sunstones he had cast and the way they were now holding the heat and preparing to guard the brothers through the long winter nights. He felt a deep sense of connection to the future of the Abbey. The hearth was no longer a cold and broken void. It was a sanctuary of sound and light. Once the curing fire was settled into its rhythmic work, Julian began the final restoration of the space. He moved with a slow and measured gait, and he gathered his tools and his canvas drop cloths with a meticulous care. He used a soft brush to remove the final traces of the fireclay dust and the granite grit from the polished floor of the refectory. He worked with the quiet intensity of a man who was finishing a long and sacred prayer. He checked the tension of the lintel and the level of the hearthstone one last time, and he felt the immense finality of the work. The heart of the Abbey was whole, and the spirit of the masonry was true, and the ritual of the season was complete. He walked to the large copper basin near the kitchen entrance, and he dipped his hands into the cold water. He washed away the red clay and the black soot and the silver dust of the carving, and he watched as the water became a dark map of the day's labor. He splashed the water over his face and his neck, and he felt the weight of the masonry lifting from his spirit. The air in the hall was now warm and comfortable, and the scent of the cedar smoke was a soothing presence. Julian dried his hands with a linen cloth, and he looked at his palms. They were dark and powerful, and they were the instruments of the stone. He was ready for the rest. The walk to his cell was a slow and rhythmic journey through the silver moonlight of the cloister. The frost was thick on the cobblestones, and the air was sharp and cold, but Julian carried the warmth of the hearth in the center of his chest. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and he felt the stillness of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment. He reached the heavy oak door of his cell and he pushed it open with a steady pressure. The room was dark and cool, and it smelled of old dust and dry straw. He did not light a candle. He moved through the shadows with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the granite walls. He removed his heavy robes, and he felt the sudden release of the tension in his shoulders and his back. He was tired and his joints were heavy with the ache of the labor, but it was a good and satisfying fatigue. He sat on the edge of the straw pallet, and he looked at the narrow window where the moon was a brilliant disk in the dark sky. He thought about the wall and the well and the hearth, and he felt the beauty of the continuity. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the anchor of the Abbey. He had given his vitality to the earth, and the earth had given him the gift of the permanence. He lay back on the pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the high meadows, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He closed his eyes and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the marrow of his bones. He saw the glow of the fire, and the mark of the ancestors, and the rising of the smoke. He was at peace. The foundation was secure and the masonry was true, and the builder was finally ready to find his own silence. The night was holding the watch, and the mountain was still, and the heart of the Abbey was warm. And in that quietude he slept. The transition from the warmth of the great refectory to the high, echoing space of the chapter house was a sudden and sensory shift. Elder Julian stood at the entrance of the chamber, and he felt the immense and vertical power of the Abbey pressing in on him from every side. The chapter house was the mind of the monastery, a place of counsel and deep silence, and its architecture was designed to lift the spirit toward the infinite sky. Above him the ceiling rose into a complex and beautiful geometry of ribbed vaults and pointed arches, and the stones looked like the frozen branches of an ancient forest. But Julian was not there to admire the beauty. He had been called to the heights to investigate a whisper of a shift, a minute fracture in the crown of the central vault that suggested the mountain was leaning into the Abbey with a new and persistent weight. He began the process of the ascent. To reach the vaults, Julian had to navigate a series of narrow and winding stone stairs that were hidden within the thickness of the walls. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the masonry. The air in the stairwell was cold and dry, and it carried the scent of old limestone and the faint metallic tang of the high minerals. He felt the strength in his legs and the steady pull in his shoulders, and he welcomed the physical challenge of the climb. He was moving from the foundation to the heights, and he understood that the stability of the Abbey depended on the integrity of both. He reached the high gallery that overlooked the chapter house, and he stood perfectly still. From this height the world below was a distant and shadowy expanse of polished oak and silver starlight. Julian reached for his longest iron pry bar and his smallest leather mallet, and he stepped onto the narrow wooden catwalk that spanned the width of the vault. The wood was seasoned and strong, but it groaned under his weight with a deep and rhythmic sound that echoed through the high vaults. He did not rush. He was the listener of the pressure, and he understood that the stone would only speak to the man who was patient enough to hear. He knelt on the catwalk and he began the process of the mapping. He ran his hands over the surface of the central rib, feeling for the hidden fractures and the subtle shifts in the alignment. The limestone was cold and smooth, and it carried the fine and silver dust of the centuries. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his palms were dark and powerful against the pale gray of the stone. He found the fracture near the center of the arch, a thin and jagged line of darkness that looked like a vein of shadow in the mineral. It was a stressed smile, a sign that the keystone was beginning to feel the immense weight of the mountain roof above it. Julian took his small mallet, and he delivered a single and measured strike to the stone. The sound was a high and clear ring, a silver melody that announced the health of the mineral. He moved the mallet along the length of the rib, and he listened for the change in the resonance. Near the fracture the sound became muffled and flat, a deep thud that spoke of a hidden void behind the masonry. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. He had found the flaw. The hearting of the vault, the rubble and the mortar that filled the space between the arches, had settled over the years, and it was no longer providing the necessary support for the crown. The restoration of the vault required a level of stability that could not be achieved from a simple catwalk. Julian had to build a high scaffold, a temporary monument of wood and iron that would support his own weight and the weight of the replacement stones. He signaled to the brothers in the hall below, and he watched as the first of the oak timbers began to rise through the center of the chamber. The wood was dark and heavy, and it moved with a slow and majestic grace, and it looked like a black shadow in the middle of the starlight. Julian caught the first timber, and he began the process of the lashing. He used a heavy hemp rope to secure the timber to the iron hooks in the gallery wall. He moved in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his hands were dark and textured against the rough fiber of the rope. He did not use a simple knot. He used a series of intricate and overlapping wraps that distributed the tension across the entire surface of the wood. The wood groaned under the pressure of the rope, and the sound was a deep and satisfying creak that echoed off the high vaults like a whispered secret. He was building the skeleton of the restoration, and he treated every joint and every wrap with the same care he gave to the stone itself. As the second and third timbers were placed, the scaffold began to take its permanent form. It was a bridge of wood and rope that spanned the distance between the gallery and the central vault. Julian stood on the new platform, and he felt the immense stability of the structure. He was now within arm's reach of the keystone, and the air was thick with the scent of the stressed oak and the dry mineral dust. He looked at the fracture in the limestone, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the builders who had come before him. They had stood in the same height, and they had handled these same stones, and they had felt the same weight in their bones. He was a part of their legacy, and they were a part of his mission. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the chapter house as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian sat back on the wooden scaffold, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the circle of the moon through the high clear-story windows, and he saw the way the silver light was dancing on the ribbed vaults. The Abbey was a living entity, and the stone was its memory, and the masonry was its prayer. He felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that he was the keeper of the crown. He was the one who ensured that the roof remained firm, and the wisdom remained safe, and the silence remained unbroken. He thought about the task that lay ahead of him, the removal of the settled harding and the placement of the new sun shims to support the keystone. It would be a labor of precision and patience, and it would require a level of concentration that left no room for the noise of the world. He was ready. The scaffold was built, and the mapping was complete, and the spirit of the vault was waiting. He felt the fatigue in his joints and the heavy ache in his shoulders, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. He gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final descent of the day. He looked at the fracture on the limestone rib, and he felt the vibration of the stone still lingering in his palms. The ritual of the inspection was complete, and the ritual of the restoration was beginning. He was the keeper of the foundation and the guardian of the heights, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the hidden staircase, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the night. He was leaving the vault in the hands of the mountain, and he knew that the stones were ready for the rise. The high altitude of the chapter house vaults offered a clarity of silence that was far removed from the grounded rhythms of the terrace or the well. Elder Julian stood on the newly constructed oak scaffold, and he felt the immense and vertical presence of the Abbey all around him. The morning light was a thin and silver ribbon that filtered through the high clear-story windows, and it illuminated the fine clouds of dust that danced in the still air. Before the fractured limestone rib could be repaired, Julian had to perform the ritual of the relief. This was the technical and high-stakes process of transferring the weight of the mountain roof from the stone keystone to the mechanical strength of the iron and the oak. It was a transition of the burden, and it required a level of concentration that left no room for the distractions of the world below. He began the process of the cushioning. He reached for a massive block of seasoned white oak which he had carved into a gentle curve to match the profile of the central vault. This was the saddle, and it was designed to be the intermediary between the unyielding stone and the powerful iron. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the heights. He lifted the saddle into position against the limestone rib, and he felt the cool and dusty texture of the mineral through the wood. He used a series of small hemp loops to temporarily secure the oak to the vault, and he watched as the shadows shifted across the surface of the stone. He spent a long time ensuring that the alignment of the saddle was true. He was not just placing a piece of wood, he was establishing the bridge of the force. If the saddle were even a fraction of an inch out of true, the pressure of the relief could cause the limestone to splinter or the rib to shift further out of balance. Julian ran his hands over the joint between the oak and the stone, and he felt for the hidden resonance of the structure. His hands were dark and textured, and the fine gray dust of the limestone made his knuckles look like carved pieces of the mountain bone. He was the listener of the pressure, and he understood that the stone would only trust the man who respected its gravity. Once the saddle was secured, Julian turned his attention to the relief screw. This was a massive and ancient tool of forged iron which had been passed down through the generations of the Abbey masons. The screw was nearly 3 feet long and as thick as a man's forearm, and the threads were deep and regular. It was a machine of immense and silent power, and it carried the scent of heavy grease and old labor. Julian gathered the iron base and the threaded pillar, and he began the process of mounting. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and he felt the vibration of the metal as it found its place on the oak scaffold. He used a series of heavy iron bolts to secure the base of the screw to the platform. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and his hands were dark and powerful against the cold metal. He did not use a simple wrench. He used a long iron bar to provide the necessary leverage, and he watched as the bolts bit into the seasoned oak. The wood made a deep and groaning sound, a melody of the masonry that echoed through the high vaults like a whispered secret. Julian was building the engine of the transformation, and he treated every joint and every turn with the same care he gave to the stone itself. He felt the immense stability of the scaffold beneath his boots, and he knew that the foundation of the relief was secure. The actual relief began with a slow and steady rotation of the iron screw. Julian inserted a long wooden handle into the eye of the threaded pillar, and he leaned his mass into the movement. He did not use the strength of his arms alone. He used the weight of his entire body, leaning his core into the pull and allowing the machine to do the work of the elevation. He felt the resistance of the gravity and the stubborn inertia of the mountain roof. The iron screw began to sing under the pressure, and the metal made a high and rhythmic sound that echoed off the high vaults of the chapter house. He moved the handle in small and measured arcs. A quarter turn of the screw represented a fraction of an inch of lift, but it carried the weight of thousands of pounds of stone. Julian watched the joint between the limestone rib and the oak saddle, and he looked for the first sign of the movement. He was the focus point of the tension, and his entire world was reduced to the space between the iron and the grain. He felt the sweat beginning to carve channels through the fine dust on his forehead, and the pull in his forearms was a warm and heavy ache. He welcomed the fatigue. It was the physical evidence of his presence in the center of the high ritual. After an hour of rhythmic and focused labor, the transition finally occurred. There was a sound like a distant piece of silk being torn, a long and slow protest from the heart of the vault. Julian stopped the turn, and he stood perfectly still. He watched as a hairline gap of darkness appeared between the limestone rib and the keystone. The mountain had let go. The weight of the roof was no longer resting on the fractured stone. It was now being carried by the oak saddle and the iron screw and the sturdy scaffold. Julian felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the vault, as though the air itself had been released from a long and heavy burden. He took his small leather mallet, and he delivered a single and measured strike to the limestone. The sound was a high and clear ring, a silver melody that announced the success of the relief. He moved the mallet along the length of the rib, and he listened for the change in the resonance. The muffled and flat thud of the previous day was gone, replaced by a sharp and vibrant energy. The stone was free. It was no longer a victim of the pressure, and it was now ready for the restoration. Julian sat back on the wooden platform, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the gap in the masonry, and he saw the way the silver light of the morning was dancing in the void. The midday bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the chapter house as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian remained on the scaffold, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the Abbey all around him. He thought about the concept of the relief, and how every structure requires a moment of release to find its true strength. He saw the iron screw as a symbol of the quiet and hidden virtues of the monastic life. It was a machine that provided the support without demanding the recognition, and it allowed the stone to find its own silence. He felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that he was the guardian of the balance. He thought about the task that lay ahead of him, the removal of the settled hearting and the placement of the new sky shims to support the vault permanently. It would be a labor of precision and technical focus, and it would require a level of concentration that left no room for the noise of the world. He was ready. The weight was transferred, and the stone was free, and the spirit of the masonry was true. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the grease and the dust and the grit. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the engine of the restoration. He gathered his tools, and he prepared for the second part of the high ritual. He looked at the iron screw one last time, and he felt the vibration of the machine still lingering in his palms. The ritual of the relief was complete, and the ritual of the restoration was waiting. He was the keeper of the foundation and the guardian of the heights, and he had done his duty. He stood on the edge of the scaffold, and he looked out over the world of the Abbey, and he felt the rooted strength of the stone. The relief of the vault had created a thin and sacred gap between the limestone rib and the central keystone, and the high air of the chapter house was now filled with the anticipation of the permanent bond. Elder Julian sat on the oak scaffold, and he looked at the small wooden crate that sat at his feet. This was the crate of the sky shims, and it contained a collection of specialized blue slate that had been harvested from the deepest and coldest vein of the high quarry. Unlike the gray limestone of the walls or the dark basalt of the well, the blue slate was a mineral of immense density and a singular and unyielding strength. It was the only material that could survive the constant pressure and the shifting temperatures of the high vaults without losing its integrity. Julian reached into the crate, and he pulled out a piece of the slate, and he felt the surprising weight and the smooth and metallic texture of the stone. He began the ritual of the sorting. Every shim had to be selected with a meticulous eye for the grain and the thickness of the mineral. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands were dark and powerful against the deep blue of the slate. He was looking for the pieces that were entirely free of hidden fractures or mineral inclusions. He held each shim up to the silver light of the clerestory windows, and he examined the edges with the precision of a jeweler. He was not just choosing a support, he was choosing a partner for the mountain. The blue slate was a bridge of strength, and it had to be as honest as the gravity it was designed to counter. He found a piece that was nearly 4 inches square and half an inch thick, and he felt the resonance of the stone as he tapped it with his fingernail. The sound was a high and clear ring, a silver note that spoke of a perfect and unbroken internal structure. This was a primary shim, and it would serve as the anchor of the restoration. Julian placed the slate on a small leather pad, and he prepared for the shaping. He did not use the heavy hammer of the terrace for this task. He reached for a small and pointed steel pick which he had forged for the fine work of the high masonry. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and he felt the vibration of the stone as he began to refine the edges of the slate. The process of the dressing was a meditation on the marriage of the metal and the mineral. Julian used the steel pick to remove the tiny jagged protrusions from the surface of the slate, and he watched as the fine blue powder of the stone began to coat his knuckles and the dark lines of his palms. The dust was different from the limestone grit. It was heavy and slightly oily, and it carried the scent of the deep mountain and the ancient silences. Julian worked the edges of the shim until they were perfectly square, and he checked the thickness with a small wooden gauge. He was building for a gap that was measured in the width of a hair, and he understood that the smallest discrepancy could lead to a failure of the arch. He shaped 4 of the primary shims and a series of smaller, tapered leaves, which would be used to provide the final and precise adjustment of the height. He moved in a slow and steady cadence, and his breath was a constant and calming sound in the high silence of the chapter house. He was the focus point of the transformation, and his entire world was reduced to the space between the steel and the blue grain. He felt the pull in his forearms and the steady ache in his neck as he leaned forward to inspect the work. He welcomed the fatigue. It was the evidence of his presence in the center of the high ritual. He was giving his own vitality to the stone to ensure the permanence of the abbey. The actual placement of the sky shims began with the seating. Julian knelt on the oak scaffold and he reached into the gap between the limestone rib and the keystone. He used a small brush to remove the final traces of the ancient mortar dust, and he felt the cool and dusty texture of the masonry through his fingers. He took the first of the blue slate shims and he slid it into the void. The stone moved with a smooth and silent grace, and it looked like a shard of the night sky in the middle of the pale limestone. Julian did not push the shim into place immediately. He felt for the hidden balance of the structure, and he waited for the stone to find its own center. He used a small wooden wedge to temporarily hold the shim in position, and then he began the process of the layering. He added the second and third shims with a meticulous care, ensuring that the grains of the slate were perfectly aligned. He was building a vertical pillar of the blue mineral that would act as a singular and unyielding foundation for the keystone. He used his small mallet to tap the shims into the depth of the joint, and the sound was a deep and resonant report that traveled through the vault and out into the great hall below. He was the listener of the pressure, and he understood the way the resonance changed when the bond was true. The final adjustment required the use of the tapered leaves. These were the thinnest pieces of the slate, and they were designed to be driven into the joint to create a state of absolute tension. Julian selected a leaf that was no thicker than a piece of parchment, and he placed it at the very top of the stack. He took his steel pick and he began to drive the leaf into the gap. He moved in a slow and rhythmic cadence, and he felt the resistance of the masonry as the joint began to tighten. He was not just filling a void, he was re-establishing the flow of the force. He was the engine of the restoration, and his body was the anchor of the project. As the tapered leaf reached its final position, Julian felt a shift in the vibration of the vault. The gap was gone. The limestone rib was no longer hanging in the air, but was once again a part of the singular and organic entity of the arch. He stood back and he looked at the work of the hour. The blue slate shims looked like a dark and powerful vein of the mountain running through the heart of the masonry. They were the silent protectors of the crown, and they were ready to carry the weight of the mountain roof for another 3 centuries. Julian felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. He had taken the heart of the high quarry, and he had lifted it to the sky, and he had given it a new purpose in the order of the Abbey. The afternoon sun moved across the high clear-story windows, and the light in the chapter house became a deep and vibrant gold. Julian remained on the oak scaffold, and he allowed the stillness of the heights to wrap around him. He thought about the concept of the crown and how every structure requires a point of absolute stability to exist. He saw the blue slate shims as a symbol of the quiet and unyielding strength of the spirit. They were hidden from the world below, and they were obscured by the beauty of the limestone, but they were the reason the Abbey stood firm against the wind and the frost. He felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that he was the keeper of the high silence. He thought about the task that lay ahead of him for the following day, the removal of the iron relief screw and the final sealing of the joint with a mixture of lime and lead. It would be a moment of finality and a moment of release. He was ready. The shims were set, and the bond was solid, and the spirit of the masonry was true. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the blue dust and the great grit. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the guardian of the heights. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He gathered his tools and he prepared for the final descent of the day. He looked at the blue slate shims one last time, and he felt the vibration of the stone still lingering in his palms. The ritual of the sky shims was complete, and the ritual of the release was waiting. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the hidden staircase, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the night. He was leaving the vault in the hands of the mountain, and he knew that the stones were ready for the watch. The high, narrow windows of the chapter house were now frames for a deep and velvet twilight, and the air was perfectly still. Elder Julian stood on the oak scaffold, and he felt the immense and vertical presence of the Abbey all around him. The blue slate shims were set, and the bond was solid, but the weight of the mountain roof was still being carried by the iron relief screw and the oak saddle. To complete the restoration, Julian had to perform the ritual of the final release. This was the moment of the transition, the point where the mechanical strength of the man was removed and the mineral strength of the stone was invited to take the burden. It was a ritual of trust and a ritual of the silence, and it required a level of concentration that left no room for the noise of the world. He began the process of the disengagement. He reached for the long wooden handle of the relief screw, and he felt the cold and oily texture of the iron against his dark palms. The machine was under an immense amount of tension, and the air around the scaffold seemed to vibrate with the potential energy of the mountain. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the heights. He did not turn the handle immediately. He spent a long time simply being present with the pressure, feeling for the hidden balance of the structure. He was the listener of the weight, and he understood that the transition had to be as slow and as patient as the growth of the mountain itself. He began the first turn of the screw. He moved the handle in a slow and steady arc, and he felt the resistance of the iron as it began to yield. The sound was a low and heavy groan, a melody of the masonry that echoed through the high vaults and out into the great hall below. Julian was not just unwinding a machine, he was allowing the mountain to return to its home. He watched the joint between the limestone rib and the blue slate shims, and he looked for the first sign of the settlement. He moved the handle another quarter turn, and he felt the tension in his own body beginning to shift. He was the engine of the release, and his muscles were the bridge of the transformation. As the iron screw continued to unwind, the sound of the chapter house began to change. The high and rhythmic sing of the metal was replaced by a deep and muffled resonance as the weight of the roof was transferred to the slate. Julian stopped the turn, and he stood perfectly still. He watched as the hairline gap between the masonry and the shims disappeared, and the blue mineral was swallowed by the pressure of the limestone. The mountain was finding its new foundation. There was a sound like a distant beat of a drum, a single and final vibration that traveled through the scaffold and into the marrow of Julian's bones. The transition was complete. The iron was free and the stone was holding the crown. Julian removed the iron relief screw and the oak saddle, and he stood on the edge of the platform to inspect the work. The blue slate shims looked like a dark and powerful vein of the mountain, and they were now a permanent part of the abbey. The limestone rib was straight and true, and the fracture was no longer a sign of the failure but a mark of the restoration. Julian took his small leather mallet, and he delivered a single and measured strike to the stone. The sound was a high and clear ring, a silver melody that announced the success of the ritual. The arch was a singular and organic entity once more, and it was ready to carry the weight of the sky for another 300 winters. The final task of the high masonry was the sealing of the joint. Julian reached for a small iron pot of molten lead which he had kept warm over a charcoal brazier on the gallery floor. The lead was a heavy and silver liquid, and it carried the scent of the deep earth and the ancient foundries. Julian used a small ceramic ladle to pour the lead into the tiny gaps around the blue slate shims. He moved with a quiet and meticulous care, and he watched as the silver metal flowed into the void and turned into a solid and unyielding anchor. The lead was the silent diplomat of the stone, and it provided a soft and yielding bed that would allow the masonry to breathe without losing its integrity. He spent a long time ensuring that the seal was perfect. He used a small iron trowel to smooth the surface of the lead, and he felt the warmth of the metal through his gloves. He was not just closing a gap, he was providing a final blessing for the work. He looked at the contrast between the silver of the lead and the blue of the slate and the gray of the limestone, and he felt a profound sense of satisfaction in the harmony of the minerals. The chapter house vaults were no longer a place of shift and tension. They were a sanctuary of stability and peace. Julian stood back and he looked at the progress of the ritual. The crown was secure and the spirit of the masonry was true. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the chapter house as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools and he began the process of the dismantling. He removed the oak timbers of the scaffold, and he coiled the hemp ropes into perfect and overlapping loops. He moved with a slow and rhythmic grace, and he felt the weight of the day settling into his joints. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the gray dust and the black grease, but he was satisfied. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he had fulfilled his purpose for the season. He took a final look at the vault, and he saw the way the silver light of the moon was dancing on the new lead seal. He walked to the hidden stone staircase, and he began the slow descent toward the world below. The air in the stairwell was cold and dry, and it carried the scent of the deep mountain. Julian moved in a quiet and focused cadence, and he felt the transition from the heights to the foundation. He reached the floor of the chapter house, and he stood in the center of the dark hall. The vault above him was a dark and powerful ridge of shadow, and he knew that the stones were resting in the center of their own gravity. He felt a deep sense of connection to the Abbey, and he knew that the wisdom of the library was safe. The walk to his cell was a slow and rhythmic journey through the silver moonlight of the cloister. Julian reached the heavy oak door, and he pushed it open with a steady pressure. The room was dark and cool, and it smelled of old dust and dry straw. He did not light a candle. He moved through the shadows with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the granite walls. He removed his heavy robes, and he dried his skin with a rough linen cloth. He felt the texture of the fabric against his knuckles and his palms, and he welcomed the sensation of the cleanliness. He was ready for the rest. He lay back on the straw pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the high quarry, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He closed his eyes, and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the marrow of his bones. He saw the blue slate shims and the silver lead and the rising of the high vaults. He was at peace. The foundation was secure and the masonry was true, and the builder was finally ready to find his own silence. The night was holding the watch, and the mountain was still, and the chapter house was firm. And in that quietude he slept.